The heater in my patrol car had been making a grinding noise for the last 40 miles, a low metallic whine that cut through the hum of the engine and the static of the radio. I'd put in a maintenance request 3 weeks ago, but the garage was backed up with winter damage, busted axles, blown tires, radiators cracked open by the cold. So I drove with the heat on low, my breath still fogging the windshield every few minutes, and kept my thermos of black coffee wedged between my thighs. It was the second week of January, and northern Montana had turned into something out of a whiteout nightmare. Highway 87 stretched north from Great Falls toward the Canadian border, cutting through wheat fields that had long since disappeared under snow, past abandoned homesteads and grain silos that leaned like broken teeth against the wind. The road itself was barely visible most nights, just 2 faint tire ruts pressed into fresh powder, bordered by reflective markers every 50 yards that glowed weakly in my headlights. I'd been patrolling this stretch for 11 years. I knew every mile marker, every turnoff, every place where the shoulder dropped away into frozen creek beds that could swallow a truck whole if you weren't careful. My name is Gideon Hollister, and I've been with the Montana Highway Patrol since I was 23. I grew up in Conrad, a farming town about 40 miles south of where I patrol now. My father worked the grain elevators until his back gave out, and my mother taught second grade at the elementary school for 30 years. I joined the patrol because I wanted to help people, because I thought I could make a difference out here in the middle of nowhere, where help could be an hour away and the weather could turn deadly in minutes. For the most part, the job was exactly what I expected. Speeding violations, stranded motorists, the occasional drunk driver weaving across the center line. But every now and then something happened that reminded me how vast and empty this part of the state really was, how easy it would be to disappear out here and never be found. This was one of those nights. The call came through dispatch just after midnight. I'd been parked at the junction of Highway 87 and County Road 220, finishing the last of my coffee and filling out paperwork from a fender bender I'd worked earlier that evening. The radio crackled, and I heard Mavis Rowe's voice cut through the static. Mavis had been working dispatch for the patrol for as long as I'd been on the force, maybe longer. She had a calm, steady way of speaking that never changed, whether she was reporting a minor traffic stop or a fatal accident. It was comforting, in a way, hearing her voice in the middle of the night when the world felt empty and endless. "Unit 12, this is dispatch," she said, her voice clear despite the interference. "We've got a missing vehicle report, northbound on Highway 87, approximately 15 miles south of Shelby. White Dodge Ram, Montana plates, last seen around 2300 hours. Driver's name is Lyle Treadway, age 47. Family called it in about 30 minutes ago. They say he was heading home from Great Falls and should have arrived by now. They tried his cell, no answer." I picked up the handset and pressed the button, feeling the cold plastic against my palm. "Copy that, dispatch. I'm currently at mile marker 142 heading north. I'll start a sweep and report back." Mavis acknowledged, and the line went silent again. I set the handset back in its cradle, finished the last swallow of coffee, and pulled the cruiser back onto the highway. The snowfall had picked up in the last hour, thick flakes swirling through my headlights and piling up on the wipers faster than they could clear it away. Visibility was maybe 100 feet, maybe less. The wind was coming from the northwest, gusting hard enough to rock the car every few seconds. I kept my speed at 40 and watched the odometer, counting the miles as they clicked past. The stretch of Highway 87 between Great Falls and Shelby is one of the loneliest roads in Montana. There are no towns along the way, no gas stations, no rest stops. Just open prairie and the occasional ranch access road that disappears into the darkness. Most of the ranches out here are set back miles from the highway, tucked into valleys or behind ridges where the wind isn't quite as brutal. In the winter, some of them are completely cut off, accessible only by snowmobile or four-wheel drive trucks with chains on all four tires. I'd worked accidents on this road before, cars that had skidded off into the ditch and sat there for hours before anyone noticed, drivers who'd tried to walk for help and ended up frozen in a field a quarter-mile from their vehicle. It was the kind of place where mistakes could kill you, and the cold didn't care how tough you thought you were. I drove slowly, scanning both sides of the road for any sign of tire tracks veering off into the snow, any indication that someone had lost control or pulled over. The radio stayed quiet. The only sound was the wind buffeting the car and the rhythmic thump of the wipers clearing the windshield. I passed mile marker 145, then 146, then 147. Nothing. The highway was empty, the snow undisturbed except for my own tire tracks disappearing behind me. I started to wonder if maybe Lyle Treadway had changed his route, taken a different road home, or stopped somewhere without telling his family. It happened more often than people wanted to admit, but something about the situation felt off. The way Mavis had said the family tried his cell and got no answer, the way the timeline didn't add up. Great Falls to Shelby was about an hour and a half in good weather, maybe 2 hours in conditions like this. If he'd left at 11, he should have been home by now. At mile marker 150-1, I saw them. Tire tracks, fresh ones, leading off the right side of the highway and down into the snow-covered ditch. I slowed the cruiser to a crawl and angled the spotlight mounted on the driver's side mirror, sweeping the beam across the field. The tracks were clear, 2 deep ruts where the vehicle had plunged off the pavement and into the softer snow below. They continued for maybe 20 yards before disappearing over a low rise. I pulled onto the shoulder, put the car in park, and left the engine running. The temperature outside was 11 degrees and the wind chill made it feel closer to 0. I grabbed my flashlight from the seat, pulled on my heavy coat and gloves, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit me immediately, a sharp, biting wind that cut through my coat and stung my face. I zipped the collar up to my chin and pulled my hat down over my ears, then clicked on the flashlight and started following the tracks. The snow was deep, well over my boots in places, and each step took effort. The beam of my flashlight cut through the falling snow, illuminating the tire ruts as they curved down into the ditch and then back up the other side, heading across the open field. I could see where the vehicle had struggled, where the tires had spun and thrown up chunks of frozen dirt and snow, where the driver had tried to power through and keep moving. But the tracks didn't stop. They just kept going, straight and steady, as if whoever was driving knew exactly where they were headed. I climbed out of the ditch and onto the flat expanse of the field, the snow now halfway up my shins. The wind was stronger out here, unbroken by the low ridge that bordered the highway. My flashlight beam swung back and forth, following the tracks as they stretched out into the darkness. I walked for maybe 50 yards, maybe more, and then I saw it. A dark shape ahead, partially buried in the snow. I moved faster, my boots crunching through the frozen crust, and as I got closer I realized it was the Dodge Ram. It was sitting in the middle of the field, perfectly upright, the engine off and the headlights dark. Snow had already begun to pile up on the hood and roof, softening the edges and making it look almost like it had been there for days instead of hours. I approached cautiously, sweeping my flashlight across the truck's exterior. The doors were closed, the windows unbroken. I couldn't see anyone inside. I stepped up to the driver's side window and cupped my hand against the glass, peering in. The cab was empty. No driver, no passengers. The keys were still in the ignition, turned to the off position. The interior looked undisturbed, no signs of a struggle or panic. There was a thermos in the cup holder, a coat folded on the passenger seat, a pair of work gloves on the dashboard. Everything looked normal, except for the fact that the truck was sitting in the middle of a frozen field, miles from the highway, and the driver was nowhere to be seen. I stepped back and scanned the area with my flashlight, looking for footprints leading away from the vehicle. The snow was falling heavily now, and visibility had dropped to maybe 30 feet. I walked around the truck, checking each side, looking for any indication of which direction Lyle Treadway might have gone. And that's when I saw them. Footprints, leading away from the driver's side door, heading north across the field. They were deep and evenly spaced, as if someone had been walking with purpose, not stumbling or running. I followed them with my flashlight, watching as they stretched out into the darkness, and then I noticed something strange. The footprints weren't alone. Next to them, running parallel but slightly offset, were other tracks. Not human footprints, not tire tracks. Something else. They were impressions in the snow, shallow and irregular, as if something heavy had been dragged or pushed along the surface. But the pattern didn't make sense. It wasn't continuous like a sled or a toboggan. It was segmented, broken into sections, each one about 3 feet long, with gaps in between where the snow was undisturbed. I crouched down and shined my light directly on one of the impressions. The snow was compressed, packed down hard, and there were faint scratches along the edges, as if something with sharp points had dug into the surface. I stood up and followed both sets of tracks, the footprints and the strange impressions, as they moved together across the field. I radioed back to dispatch, pressing the button on the handheld unit clipped to my belt. Dispatch, Unit 12. I've located the missing vehicle, mile marker 151, approximately 200 yards east of the highway in an open field. Vehicle is unoccupied, engine off, no visible damage. I've got footprints leading north from the driver's side, and there are additional tracks in the snow that I can't identify. Requesting backup and a K9 unit if available. Mavis's voice came back immediately. Copy that, Unit 12. Be advised. Nearest backup is 40 minutes out due to road conditions. K9 unit is currently assisting with a search in Cascade County, estimated 2 hours before they can respond. Proceed with caution and report any findings. I acknowledged and kept moving, following the tracks as they led deeper into the field. The wind was relentless, driving snow into my face and making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. My flashlight beam bounced and swayed with each step, casting long shadows across the white expanse. The footprints were still clear, but the strange impressions next to them were becoming harder to follow. In some places, the wind had already begun to fill them in, smoothing the snow and erasing the details. I picked up my pace, knowing that if I didn't stay on the trail now, I might lose it completely. After another 100 yards, the footprints stopped. Not gradually, not trailing off or becoming shallower. They just stopped, as if the person making them had simply vanished mid-step. I stood there, staring down at the last clear print, and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I swung my flashlight in a wide arc, searching for any continuation of the trail, any indication that Lyle Treadway had changed direction or doubled back. But there was nothing. Just smooth, undisturbed snow stretching out in every direction. The only tracks left were the strange impressions, and they continued on for maybe another 10 feet before they too disappeared, fading into the wind-blown drifts like they'd never been there at all. I stood in the middle of that field for a long time, the wind howling around me, the snow piling up on my shoulders and the brim of my hat. I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, tried to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe Lyle had turned around and walked back toward the truck, stepping in his own footprints to confuse anyone following him. Maybe the wind had covered his tracks faster than I realized. Maybe I was just too cold and too tired to see clearly. But none of those explanations felt right. The footprints had been deep and clear, too fresh for the wind to have erased them completely, and the strange impressions, whatever they were, didn't match anything I'd ever seen before. I radioed dispatch again, trying to keep my voice steady. Unit 12, dispatch. I've lost the trail approximately 300 yards north of the vehicle. Footprints terminate abruptly with no clear continuation. Additional unidentified tracks also terminate nearby. Visibility is near zero, and conditions are deteriorating. I'm going to return to the vehicle and secure it as a scene. We'll need crime scene techs and additional units for a full grid search at first light. Mavis responded with the same calm tone she always had. Copy, Unit 12. Units are being dispatched for morning support. Return to your vehicle and stay warm. We'll have more resources at dawn. I turned and started walking back toward the Dodge Ram, following my own footprints in the snow. The truck looked even more buried now, the snow accumulating faster than I'd expected. I circled it one more time, checking the bed, looking under the chassis, searching for anything I might have missed. The truck was clean. No blood, no signs of violence, no indication that anything had gone wrong. It was as if Lyle Treadway had simply parked in the middle of a field, turned off the engine, and walked away into a blizzard. And then something else had walked with him. I stood there beside the truck for a moment, listening to the wind and feeling the cold seep through my gloves. I thought about Lyle's family waiting at home, wondering why he hadn't arrived. I thought about how many hours it would take to organize a proper search, how many miles of empty prairie we'd have to cover. And I thought about those tracks, the ones that didn't belong to anything human, the ones that had followed a man into the darkness and then vanished without explanation. I didn't have answers. Not yet. But I knew one thing for certain. Something had happened out here. Something that didn't fit the pattern of a simple breakdown or a driver losing his way. And whatever it was, I had the feeling it was still out there, somewhere beyond the reach of my flashlight, watching from the edges of the storm. I made it back to my patrol car just after 2 a.m, my face numb from the cold and my legs aching from pushing through the deep snow. I climbed into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut, sealing out the wind and the endless white noise of the storm. The heater was still running, and I held my gloved hands up to the vents, trying to force warmth back into my fingers. My breath came out in short, visible puffs, and I sat there for a moment, staring through the windshield at the wall of falling snow, trying to process what I'd just seen. The footprints that ended in the middle of nowhere. The strange impressions in the snow that didn't match anything I could identify. The abandoned truck sitting in the middle of a field with no explanation. None of it made sense, and the more I turned it over in my mind, the less sense it made. I picked up the radio handset and pressed the button. Dispatch, Unit 12. I'm back at my vehicle. The scene is secure, and I've marked the location on GPS. I'll need road flares and crime scene tape brought out with the morning units. Also, requesting a thermal imaging drone if one's available. If Lyle Treadway is still out there on foot, we need to find him before hypothermia sets in. Mavis's voice crackled back through the speaker. Copy that, Unit 12. I've notified the family that we've located his vehicle and that search efforts will resume at first light. They're asking if there's any indication of foul play or if he might have been injured. I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. Tell them we have no evidence of foul play at this time, but the situation is unusual. We're treating it as a missing person case and doing everything we can to locate him safely. Mavis acknowledged, and the line went quiet again. I pulled out my notebook and started writing down everything I'd observed, every detail I could remember. The position of the truck, the tire tracks leading off the highway, the footprints heading north, the strange impressions that ran parallel to them. I drew a rough sketch of the field, marking distances and directions, noting the wind speed and the visibility. It was standard procedure. the kind of documentation I'd done 100 times before. But this time it felt different. This time I kept stopping mid-sentence, staring at the words I'd written, wondering if I was documenting a disappearance or something else entirely. I thought about calling it in as a potential abduction, but I had no evidence to support that. No signs of a struggle, no second vehicle, no indication that anyone else had been involved. Just those tracks in the snow, the ones that didn't belong. The rest of the night passed slowly. I stayed parked on the shoulder, engine running, watching the road and waiting for backup. A few trucks passed by, their headlights cutting through the snow, but none of them stopped. I checked in with dispatch every 30 minutes, reporting no changes, no new developments. Around 4 in the morning, the snow began to ease up, the wind dropping to a steady blow instead of the violent gusts that had rocked my car earlier. Visibility improved to maybe a quarter mile, and I could start to make out the shapes of the distant ridges against the dark sky. I climbed out of the car and walked back to the edge of the field, shining my flashlight across the expanse of white. The tire tracks were still visible, though softer now. The edges blurred by fresh accumulation. I didn't go any farther. I knew better than to contaminate the scene before the full search team arrived. By 6:30, the sky had started to lighten, a pale gray glow spreading across the eastern horizon. The storm had moved on, leaving behind a landscape that looked almost peaceful in the early morning light. The snow lay in smooth, unbroken drifts, and the air was still and cold. I heard the sound of engines approaching from the south, and a few minutes later, 2 patrol cars pulled up behind mine, followed by a sheriff's department SUV and a flatbed tow truck. The lead car belonged to Sergeant Dale Pritchard, a 20-year veteran with the patrol who'd been stationed in Shelby for as long as I could remember. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick through the middle, with a gray mustache and a face weathered by decades of Montana winters. He climbed out of his car and walked over to mine, his breath steaming in the cold air. "Hell of a night to lose somebody," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. Mavis filled me in on the basics. "You found the truck, but no driver?" I nodded. "It's out in the field, about 200 yards east of here. I followed footprints for maybe 300 yards north before they disappeared. There were other tracks too, something I couldn't identify. I marked the area on GPS, but the snow might have covered some of it by now." Pritchard frowned, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean, other tracks?" I pulled out my notebook and showed him the sketch I'd drawn. They ran parallel to the footprints, shallow impressions in the snow. They didn't look like animal tracks, didn't look like anything I've seen before. They were segmented, maybe 3 feet long, with gaps in between, and they had these scratches along the edges, like something sharp had dragged through the snow. Pritchard studied the sketch for a moment, then looked up at me. "You think an animal might have been following him? Coyote, maybe? Wolf?" I shook my head. The impressions were too large for a coyote, and wolves don't leave tracks like that. And if it was an animal, why didn't it attack? Why did the tracks just stop at the same place the footprints did? Pritchard didn't have an answer for that. He handed the notebook back to me and looked out across the field, his jaw working as he chewed over the problem. "All right," he said finally. "Let's get a team out there and do a proper grid search. We've got 3 more units coming in from Conrad, and the K9 handler from Cascade County is about an hour out. We'll start at the truck and work our way out in a spiral pattern. If Lyle Treadway is still out there, we'll find him." We spent the next hour organizing the search. The tow truck driver positioned his vehicle on the shoulder, ready to haul the Dodge Ram back to the impound lot once we'd finished processing it. The other patrol officers geared up with cold weather gear and handheld radios, and we divided the field into sections, assigning each team a specific area to cover. I led Pritchard and 2 other officers out to the truck, retracing the path I'd taken the night before. The snow had filled in some of my footprints, but the tire tracks were still visible, cutting deep ruts through the drifts. When we reached the Dodge Ram, Pritchard walked around it slowly, examining the exterior, looking through the windows, checking the undercarriage. He crouched down by the driver's side door and studied the snow around it, then stood up and looked at me. "You said the footprints headed north from here?" I pointed toward the direction I'd followed the night before. "Yeah, straight line, evenly spaced. No signs of stumbling or hesitation. Whoever was walking knew where they were going." Pritchard nodded and motioned for the other officers to fan out. "Let's follow the trail and see where it leads. Stay in visual contact with each other. And if you find anything at all, call it in immediately." We moved out across the field in a line. 4 of us spread about 20 yards apart, walking slowly and scanning the snow for any signs of disturbance. The morning sun was climbing higher now, casting long shadows across the drifts and making the surface sparkle like broken glass. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way, the kind of beauty that could kill you if you weren't careful. I found the spot where the footprints had ended, the last clear impression still visible despite the overnight accumulation. I called out to Pritchard and he came over, kneeling down to examine the print. "This is it?" he asked. "This is where they stopped?" I nodded. No continuation, no sign of backtracking, just this one print, and then nothing. Pritchard stood up and looked around, his eyes scanning the snow in every direction. "And the other tracks, the ones you couldn't identify, where were they?" I pointed to a spot about 10 feet to the left. "They ran parallel to the footprints, but they stopped around here. The wind might have covered them, but I swear they were there last night." We spread out again, searching for any trace of the strange impressions I'd described. One of the other officers, a younger guy named Ferris, called out from about 30 yards ahead. "Sergeant, I've got something here." We hurried over to where Ferris was standing, and he pointed down at the snow. There, faint but still visible, was one of the impressions. It was exactly as I'd described it. A shallow, segmented mark in the snow with scratches along the edges. Pritchard crouched down and ran his gloved hand over it, his brow furrowed in concentration. "What the hell makes a track like this?" he muttered. Ferris shook his head. "I have no idea. It almost looks like something was dragged, but the pattern's all wrong. It's too uniform, too deliberate." Pritchard stood up and keyed his radio. "All units, we've confirmed unusual tracks in the snow approximately 300 yards north of the vehicle. Continue the search and report any additional findings." We kept moving, following the faint traces of the impressions as they led farther north. The terrain began to change, the flat expanse of the field giving way to a shallow depression that ran east to west. A dry creek bed that would have been flowing with snowmelt in the spring, but now lay buried under several feet of snow. The impressions led down into the depression and then up the other side, and we followed them, our boots crunching through the frozen crust. On the far side of the depression, the tracks stopped again, not gradually, but abruptly, as if whatever had made them had simply ceased to exist. Pritchard stood at the edge of the disturbance, staring down at the snow, his face unreadable. "This doesn't make any sense," he said quietly. "Tracks don't just disappear. There has to be a continuation somewhere." We searched the area for another 20 minutes, covering every inch of snow within a 100-yard radius. We found nothing. No footprints, no impressions, no sign that anything had passed through the area. It was as if the trail had been erased, wiped clean by some invisible hand. The K9 unit arrived just before 9 in the morning. A German shepherd named Rex and his handler, a deputy named Orrin McKelvey from Cascade County. McKelvey was a lean, weathered man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. He listened to our briefing, nodded a few times, and then walked Rex out to the Dodge Ram to get a scent. The dog sniffed around the driver's side door, his nose working over the seat and the steering wheel, and then McKelvey gave him the command to search. Rex took off across the field, following the same path we'd walked, his nose close to the snow. We followed behind, watching as the dog moved with purpose, his tail up and his ears forward. He tracked the scent all the way to the spot where the footprints had ended, and then he stopped. He circled the area a few times, sniffing the snow, and then he sat down and looked back at McKelvey, whining softly. McKelvey frowned and walked over to the dog, kneeling down beside him. "What's wrong, boy? Where'd he go?" Rex whined again and pawed at the snow, but he didn't move. McKelvey stood up and looked at Pritchard. "He's got the scent, but he's confused. It's like the trail just stops here. He doesn't know which direction to go." Pritchard rubbed his jaw and stared out across the empty field. "So we've got footprints that end in the middle of nowhere. Strange tracks that don't match any known animal, and a K9 that can't pick up a scent. What the hell are we dealing with here?" Nobody had an answer. We stood there in the cold morning sun, 4 patrol officers and a search dog, surrounded by miles of snow-covered prairie, and none of us could explain what we were seeing. Pritchard finally keyed his radio and called back to dispatch. "Dispatch, this is Unit 7. We've completed the initial grid search with negative results. The subject's trail terminates without explanation, and the K9 unit is unable to track further. Requesting air support for a wider area search and advising that this case be escalated to missing persons with possible unknown circumstances." Mavis's voice came back, as calm and steady as ever. "Copy that, Unit 7. Air support is being coordinated through Great Falls. Estimated arrival time is 2 hours. Continue ground search efforts and maintain scene integrity." Pritchard acknowledged and turned to the rest of us. "All right, let's expand the search radius. Ferris, you take the east quadrant. Hollister, you've got west. I'll take north and we'll have another unit cover south. If Lyle Treadway walked out of here, he had to go somewhere. Let's find him." We split up and started walking, each of us moving in a different direction, our eyes scanning the snow for any sign of disturbance. I headed west, moving slowly and methodically, checking every drift and every hollow. The sun was higher now, and the temperature had climbed to maybe 15 degrees, just warm enough to make the snow glisten and the air feel a little less brutal. I walked for over an hour, covering more than a mile, and found nothing. No footprints, no tracks, no indication that anyone had passed through the area in days. I radioed back to Pritchard and reported my findings, and he acknowledged with the same results from his quadrant. By noon, the helicopter arrived, a state police bird out of Great Falls with thermal imaging equipment. It circled the area for over an hour, sweeping back and forth in a grid pattern, the pilot reporting back to us on the radio. "Ground units, this is Air 1. We're not picking up any heat signatures in the search area. No signs of a body, no signs of recent activity. Whatever happened here, he's not in the immediate vicinity." Pritchard thanked the pilot and called off the aerial search. We regrouped at the highway, standing around our patrol cars, exhausted and frustrated. The Dodge Ram had been loaded onto the flatbed and was ready to be towed. Crime scene techs had processed the interior, lifting fingerprints and collecting samples, but there was nothing to suggest foul play. The truck was clean, almost too clean, as if it had been wiped down before being abandoned. Pritchard pulled me aside as the other officers started packing up their gear. "What's your gut tell you, Hollister?" I looked out across the field, at the endless expanse of white that stretched to the horizon. "I don't know, Sergeant. I've worked missing person cases before, and they always leave something behind. A trail, a clue, some indication of where they went. But this is different. It's like he just vanished." Pritchard nodded slowly. And those tracks you saw, the ones that don't match anything, you sure about what you saw?" I met his eyes. "I'm sure. I don't know what made them, but they were there, and they followed him until he disappeared." Pritchard didn't say anything for a long time. He just stood there, staring out at the field, his breath steaming in the cold air. Finally, he clapped me on the shoulder. "Get some rest, Hollister. You've been out here all night. We'll keep working the case, follow up with the family, check his phone records, see if we can piece together where he was before he left Great Falls. Maybe something will turn up." I nodded and climbed into my patrol car, starting the engine and letting the heater blow warm air across my face. As I pulled away from the scene and headed back toward Conrad, I looked in the rearview mirror at the field one last time. The snow was already beginning to fill in the tracks we'd made, smoothing over the disturbances, erasing the evidence of our search. In a few hours, it would look like no one had been there at all, and maybe that was the point. I didn't sleep well that day. I made it back to my apartment in Conrad around 2 in the afternoon, exhausted and cold down to my bones, but every time I closed my eyes I saw those footprints ending in the middle of the snow, the strange impressions running alongside them, the empty field stretching out in every direction with no answers. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind rattle the windows, and tried to make sense of what I'd witnessed. By 6 in the evening, I gave up on rest entirely and drove to the patrol station to write up my official report. The building was quiet, just a skeleton crew working the evening shift, and I sat at my desk in the bullpen with a cup of bad coffee and filled out the incident forms with as much detail as I could remember. The hardest part was describing the tracks. I wrote that they were unidentified impressions inconsistent with known wildlife or vehicle patterns, and I attached the sketches I'd made in my notebook. But I knew how it would read to anyone reviewing the case file. It sounded vague, uncertain, like I didn't know what I was talking about. I thought about adding more, about emphasizing how clear and deliberate the marks had been, but I didn't want to sound like I was exaggerating or letting my imagination run wild. So I kept it factual, kept it simple, and submitted the report to Sergeant Pritchard's inbox before heading back out into the cold night. I had another shift starting at midnight, and I needed to be ready. The next few days passed in a blur of routine patrol work and unanswered questions. The case of Lyle Treadway's disappearance was officially handed over to the Montana Department of Justice's Missing Persons Unit, and a team of investigators from Helena came up to take over the lead. They re-interviewed the family, pulled Treadway's phone records, checked his bank accounts, talked to his employer at the construction company where he'd worked for 15 years. Everything came back clean. No financial problems, no history of mental illness, no indication that he'd been planning to disappear. His cell phone had pinged off a tower near Great Falls around 10:30 that night, consistent with him leaving the city when he said he would, and then it had gone dark. No more pings, no more activity. It was as if the phone had been turned off or destroyed somewhere along Highway 87. The investigators also brought in a team from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to examine the photographs of the strange tracks. I sat in on the meeting at the patrol station, watching as they pulled up the images on a laptop and studied them in silence. The lead biologist, a woman named Dr. Iris Caldwell, zoomed in on the impressions, measured the spacing, analyzed the scratches along the edges. She was in her 40s with graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and a pair of wire-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. She had a calm, methodical way of working, and I could tell she'd seen a lot of strange things in her career. After 20 minutes of examination, she leaned back in her chair and looked at Sergeant Pritchard. "I can't identify these," she said, her voice measured. "They don't match any known animal tracks in Montana. The segmented pattern is unusual, and the depth suggests something heavy, but the spacing doesn't correspond to a gait pattern. If I had to guess, I'd say it looks more like something was dragged intermittently across the snow, but that doesn't explain the scratches or the uniformity of the marks. Pritchard frowned. Could it be a piece of equipment, something mechanical? Dr. Caldwell shook her head. Possible, but unlikely. There's no evidence of fuel residue, no tire marks, no indication that any machinery was in the area. And if someone was dragging equipment, why would they stop at the same place the footprints stopped? The room went quiet. One of the investigators from Helena, a clean-cut man in his 30s named Agent Strickland, spoke up. What about fabrication? Could Officer Hollister have misinterpreted what he saw, or could the tracks have been altered by the wind? I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice calm. The tracks were clear when I found them. I followed them for over 300 yards. The wind hadn't filled them in yet, and the pattern was consistent the entire way. I know what I saw. Strickland nodded, but I could see the skepticism in his eyes. I'm not questioning your professionalism, officer. I'm just trying to rule out natural explanations before we start considering alternatives. Dr. Caldwell closed the laptop and handed it back to Pritchard. I'll file my report, but I have to be honest with you. I've worked wildlife cases for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like this. If you want a definitive answer, you'll need to bring in a forensic expert with more resources than I have. Pritchard thanked her, and the meeting broke up. I stayed behind as the others filed out, waiting until it was just me and Pritchard in the conference room. He looked tired, the lines around his eyes deeper than I remembered. You holding up all right, Hollister? He asked. I nodded. Yeah, I'm fine, just frustrated. I feel like we're missing something obvious. Pritchard leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. The family's offering a reward now. $10,000 for any information leading to Lyle's whereabouts. The media's picking up the story, too. We've got a reporter from the Great Falls Tribune coming up tomorrow to do a piece on the investigation. So, we need to be prepared for this to get bigger before it gets smaller. I didn't like the sound of that. Media attention meant more scrutiny, more people asking questions we couldn't answer. What do you want me to do? I asked. Pritchard looked at me for a long moment. I want you to go back out there. Tonight. Do another pass along Highway 87, check the area around where we found the truck. Sometimes things turn up after the snow settles, things we missed the first time. And if you see anything at all, call it in immediately. I left the station just before midnight and headed north on Highway 87. The roads had been plowed since the storm, and the driving was easier, but the temperature had dropped again, down to 5 degrees, and the wind was back, gusting hard enough to send plumes of snow drifting across the pavement. I drove slowly, my spotlight sweeping the shoulders and the fields beyond, looking for any sign of disturbance. The night was clear, the moon nearly full, and the snow reflected its light in a pale, ghostly glow that made the landscape look almost otherworldly. I passed the spot where I'd found the Dodge Ram, marked now by a small orange flag the investigators had left behind, and I pulled over onto the shoulder. I sat there for a moment, engine running, staring out at the field. The tire tracks were gone, filled in by wind and fresh snow, and the area looked pristine, untouched. I thought about driving on, continuing my patrol, but something made me turn off the engine and step out into the cold. I grabbed my flashlight and walked to the edge of the field, shining the beam across the snow. Everything was still, silent except for the wind. I started walking, following the same path I'd taken that first night, my boots crunching through the frozen crust. The moonlight was bright enough that I didn't really need the flashlight, but I kept it on anyway, sweeping it back and forth, looking for anything out of place. I made it about 100 yards before I saw them. Fresh tracks in the snow, leading east across the field. They weren't human footprints. They were the same strange impressions I'd seen before, the segmented marks with scratches along the edges. My heart started pounding, and I keyed my radio immediately. Dispatch, Unit 12. I'm at mile marker 151, east side of Highway 87. I've got fresh tracks in the snow, same pattern as the unidentified impressions from the original scene. Requesting backup to my location. Mavis's voice came back, calm as ever. Copy that, Unit 12. Nearest unit is 20 minutes out. Do not pursue alone. Wait for backup. I stood there, flashlight trained on the tracks, and felt a cold knot form in my stomach. These weren't old tracks that had been hidden by the snow. These were new, made within the last few hours, maybe even the last hour. The edges were sharp, the snow around them undisturbed. I followed them with my eyes, watching as they led deeper into the field, toward the same area where the original tracks had disappeared. I knew I should wait for backup. I knew the protocol, but something inside me, some instinct I couldn't explain, told me that if I didn't follow them now, they'd be gone by the time help arrived. I started walking, keeping my radio keyed so dispatch could hear me. Unit 12, I'm moving east along the track line. Visibility is good, and I'm maintaining radio contact. If I lose signal, send units to my last known position. Mavis acknowledged, and I heard the tension in her voice. I kept my flashlight trained on the tracks, following them as they led across the field in a straight line. The pattern was the same as before. Segmented marks about 3 feet long with gaps in between. Scratches along the edges like something with claws or sharp points had dragged through the snow. I walked for maybe 200 yards, my breath steaming in the cold air, and then the track stopped. Not gradually, not fading into the distance. They just stopped. The last impression clear and sharp, and beyond it, nothing but smooth, undisturbed snow. I stood there, staring down at the end of the trail, and felt a wave of frustration wash over me. It was the same as before, the same inexplicable termination, the same absence of any logical continuation. I swept my flashlight in a wide arc, searching for any sign of where the tracks might have gone, but there was nothing. I keyed my radio again. Dispatch, Unit 12. The tracks have terminated approximately 200 yards east of the highway. No continuation visible. I'm holding position and waiting for backup. The wait felt like hours, though it was probably only 15 minutes. I stood there in the moonlight, my flashlight aimed at the last impression, and tried not to think about what could make tracks like this. Tried not to think about the fact that Lyle Treadway had disappeared following a similar trail, and that now, days later, something was still out here, moving through the snow, leaving marks that didn't belong to anything I could name. When I finally heard the sound of an engine approaching on the highway, I felt a wave of relief. I turned and saw headlights cutting through the darkness, a patrol car pulling onto the shoulder behind mine. The driver's door opened, and Officer Ferris stepped out, his hand resting on his sidearm. "Hollister, you all right?" he called out. I waved my flashlight so he could see me. "Yeah, I'm fine. The tracks are over here." Ferris made his way across the field, his boots sinking into the snow, and stopped beside me. He looked down at the impressions, then up at me, his face pale in the moonlight. Jesus, these are the same ones from before. I nodded, fresh too, made within the last few hours. Ferris crouched down and ran his gloved hand over one of the marks, tracing the scratches with his finger. What the hell is making these? I shook my head. I don't know, but whatever it is, it's still out here. We radioed back to dispatch and requested a full forensic team to come out and document the tracks before they could be obscured by wind or more snow. Within an hour, the field was lit up by portable floodlights, and a team of technicians was taking photographs, making plaster casts, collecting samples of the snow and the surrounding soil. Sergeant Pritchard arrived just after 2 in the morning, his face drawn and grim. He walked over to where Ferris and I were standing, looked down at the tracks, and let out a long, slow breath. "This is the 3rd time now," he said quietly. "3rd time we've found these tracks, and we still don't know what's making them." I looked at him. "3rd time?" Pritchard nodded. "We got a call from a rancher about 10 miles north of here yesterday afternoon. He found similar tracks crossing his property, leading from the road toward his barn. By the time we got out there to investigate, they were mostly filled in by the wind, but he took photos. Same pattern, same segmented marks." I felt my chest tighten. "Did he see anything, hear anything?" Pritchard shook his head. "Nothing. He said his dogs were going crazy the night before, barking and growling at something outside, but when he went out with a flashlight he didn't see anything. Just the tracks the next morning." Ferris spoke up. "So, whatever this is, it's moving, it's not staying in one place." Pritchard looked out across the field, his jaw set. "That's what it looks like. And if it's moving, we need to figure out where it's going and what it wants. Because right now, we've got a missing man and a pattern of activity we can't explain, and that's a combination that doesn't sit well with me." He turned to the forensic team. "I want every inch of this area photographed and documented. I want soil samples, snow samples, anything that might give us a clue. And I want a patrol unit stationed at this location 24 hours a day until we figure out what's going on." The technicians worked through the night, carefully casting the impressions and bagging samples. By dawn, the field looked like a crime scene. Yellow tape strung between stakes, evidence markers scattered across the snow. I stayed until the sun came up, watching as the forensic team packed up their equipment and loaded it into their vans. Pritchard pulled me aside before I left. "Get some rest, Hollister. You've been running on fumes for 3 days now. I'll have Ferris take over the watch here and we'll rotate shifts so everyone stays fresh." I nodded, too tired to argue. "What do you think is going on, Sergeant?" Pritchard was quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the field. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I've been doing this job for 20 years, and I've learned to trust my instincts. And my instincts are telling me that we're dealing with something we don't understand, something that doesn't follow the rules we're used to. So we're going to treat this like any other investigation. We're going to follow the evidence, document everything, and keep looking until we find answers. Because Lyle Treadway's family deserves to know what happened to him, and we owe it to them to find the truth, no matter how strange it turns out to be." I drove back to Conrad as the sun climbed higher, the morning light turning the snow into a blinding sheet of white. I thought about Pritchard's words, about the idea that we might be dealing with something we didn't understand. I thought about the tracks that appeared and disappeared without explanation, about the way the K9 had lost the scent, about the rancher's dogs barking at something invisible in the night. And I thought about Lyle Treadway, walking across a frozen field in the middle of a blizzard, following a trail that led nowhere, vanishing into the darkness without a trace. Whatever was out there, it was still moving, still leaving its mark on the snow. And I had the feeling that it wasn't done yet. I slept for 4 hours and woke up to my phone ringing. It was Pritchard. His voice was tight, controlled, the way it got when something serious was happening. "Hollister, I need you back out here. We've got a situation." I sat up in bed, already reaching for my uniform. "What kind of situation?" There was a pause on the line, and I could hear wind in the background, the crackle of radio chatter. The tracks moved again. They showed up at the rancher's property, the same one I told you about. But this time they didn't stop at his barn. They went inside. I was dressed and out the door in 5 minutes, my patrol car cutting through the afternoon traffic in Conrad as I headed north on Highway 87. The sky was overcast, heavy gray clouds pressing down on the landscape, and the temperature had dropped again, hovering just above zero. Pritchard had given me directions to the ranch, a sprawling property about 12 miles north of where we'd found Lyle Treadway's truck. I turned off the highway onto a gravel access road that wound through snow-covered fields, past frozen irrigation ditches and collapsed fences, until I saw the cluster of buildings ahead. There were 3 patrol cars already parked in the yard, along with Pritchard's SUV and an ambulance with its lights off. I pulled in beside Ferris's cruiser and stepped out into the cold. The ranch house was a weathered 2-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging porch, the kind of place that had probably been in the same family for generations. Behind it stood a large red barn, its doors hanging open, and I could see Pritchard standing just inside, talking to a man in a heavy work coat and a stained baseball cap. I walked over, my boots crunching through the frozen snow, and Pritchard turned as I approached. "Hollister, this is Virgil Kemper. He owns this property." The man nodded at me, his face pale and drawn. He looked to be in his 60s, with deep-set eyes and a gray beard that hadn't been trimmed in weeks. "Tell Officer Hollister what you told me," Pritchard said. Virgil cleared his throat and looked down at his boots. "I came out to feed the cattle this morning, like I always do. Soon as I opened the barn door, I knew something was wrong. The cows were all pressed up against the back wall, spooked to hell, and there were tracks on the floor, going from the door all the way to the feed storage room in the back. Same tracks I saw outside 2 days ago, the ones I called you about." I looked past him into the barn. The interior was dim, lit only by the gray light filtering through gaps in the roof. I could see the cattle huddled together in the far corner, their eyes wide and their breath steaming in the cold air. "Can I see the tracks?" I asked. Virgil nodded and led us inside. The barn smelled of hay and manure, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of snow that had blown in through the open doors. And there, running from the entrance to the back of the barn, were the tracks. The same segmented impressions, the same scratches along the edges, the same impossible pattern that we'd been chasing for days. But these were different in one crucial way. They were deeper, pressed harder into the floor, as if whatever made them had been carrying more weight or moving with more force. I crouched down and examined one of the marks, running my gloved hand over the scratches. They cut through the thin snow and into the dirt beneath, leaving grooves that looked almost deliberate, almost purposeful. "Where do they lead?" I asked. Virgil pointed toward the back of the barn. "Feed room. Door was closed when I left last night, but this morning it was open, and the lock was broken." Pritchard and I exchanged a look, and he motioned for Ferris and the other officers to join us. We moved as a group toward the back of the barn, our flashlights cutting through the shadows. The feed room was a small enclosed space with shelves lining the walls and bags of grain stacked on wooden pallets. The door hung at an odd angle, the deadbolt bent and twisted as if it had been forced open from the outside. But there was no sign of tool marks, no indication that anyone had used a crowbar or a hammer. It looked like something had simply pulled the door open with enough force to snap the bolt. Inside the feed room, the tracks continued. They circled the space, weaving between the stacks of grain bags, and then they stopped in the center of the room. Just like before, just like every other time, they simply ended. No continuation, no trail leading back out. I swept my flashlight across the floor, the walls, the ceiling, looking for any explanation. And that's when I saw it. On the far wall, about 6 feet off the ground, were scratch marks, deep, parallel gouges in the wood, 4 of them running horizontally for about 2 feet. They looked fresh, the exposed wood still light in color, and they were positioned at an angle that didn't make sense for any animal I knew. "What the hell could make marks like that?" Ferris whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know, But whatever it was in here last night. Pritchard stepped forward and examined the scratches, running his hand along the gouges. These are deep. Whatever did this had claws, and it was strong enough to tear through solid wood. He turned to Virgil. "Did you hear anything last night? Any sounds coming from the barn?" Virgil shook his head. "Not a damn thing. But like I told you before, the dogs were going crazy around midnight, barking and howling. I came out with my shotgun and a flashlight, walked around the property, didn't see nothing. So I figured it was coyotes or maybe a mountain lion passing through. Dogs finally settled down around 1 in the morning, and I went back to bed." Pritchard pulled out his radio and called back to dispatch. "Mavis, this is Unit 7. We're going to need a full forensic team out at the Kemper Ranch. Mile marker 163 on County Road 220. We've got evidence of forced entry, structural damage, and additional track patterns matching the Highway 87 case. Also, request a wildlife expert and a structural engineer to assess the damage." Mavis acknowledged, and Pritchard turned to the rest of us. "Nobody touches anything until the techs get here. I want this place documented from top to bottom. Ferris, you and Hollister canvass the property, look for any other signs of disturbance. Check the house, the outbuildings, anywhere those tracks might lead." We spent the next 2 hours searching the ranch. The tracks appeared in several locations, always following the same pattern, always ending abruptly. We found them leading from the barn to a tool shed, from the shed to a collapsed chicken coop, from the coop back toward the tree line that bordered the property. Each time they stopped without explanation, and each time we found new scratch marks on nearby structures. Posts, walls, even the side of Virgil's pickup truck, all bearing the same deep parallel gouges. The forensic team arrived just before dark, along with Dr. Caldwell and a structural engineer from Great Falls named Merritt Voss. They worked through the evening, photographing and measuring, taking samples and making casts. I stood outside the barn with Pritchard as the sun set, watching the technicians move back and forth with their equipment. The temperature was dropping fast and my breath came out in thick white clouds. "This is escalating," I said quietly. Pritchard nodded. "Whatever this is, it's getting bolder. First, it was just tracks in the snow, easy to miss, easy to ignore. Now it's breaking into buildings, leaving physical evidence. It's almost like it wants to be noticed." I looked at him. "You think it's connected to Lyle Treadway's disappearance?" Pritchard was quiet for a moment. "I think we have to consider the possibility that whatever made these tracks had something to do with why he's gone. I don't know if it took him, or chased him, or if he was running from it. But the timing's too close to be a coincidence." Dr. Caldwell joined us, pulling off her gloves and tucking them into her coat pocket. "I've taken samples from the scratch marks and the track impressions. I'll run them through every database I have access to, but I have to be honest with you, I'm not optimistic. These don't match any known species in North America. The claw spacing, the depth, the force required to make these marks, none of it fits any predator I'm aware of." Merritt Voss approached from the barn, a clipboard in his hand and a troubled expression on his face. "I've examined the structural damage to the feed room door and the scratch marks on the walls. Based on the angle and the depth, whatever did this was applying at least 300 pounds of force. That's consistent with a large bear, but the claw pattern is all wrong. Bears leave marks that are more vertical, grouped closer together. These are horizontal, evenly spaced, almost methodical." Pritchard rubbed his jaw. "So we're looking for something that's strong, has claws, and moves in a way that doesn't match any known animal. And it's active in sub-zero temperatures, which rules out most reptiles. What does that leave us?" Nobody had an answer. We stood there in the growing darkness, the wind picking up and carrying with it the promise of more snow. Virgil came out of the house with a thermos of coffee, offering it around, and we took turns warming our hands on the metal container. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked. "I've got livestock to take care of, and I can't have whatever this is coming back and tearing up my property." Pritchard looked at him. "We're going to station a unit here overnight. Keep an eye on things, and I'm going to recommend you bring your cattle into the near pasture, closer to the house where we can see them. If this thing comes back, we'll be ready." The patrol unit set up a rotation, 2 officers on site at all times, parked in the yard with a clear view of the barn and the surrounding buildings. I volunteered for the first shift, along with Ferris. We sat in my cruiser with the engine running and the heater on low, watching the darkness settle over the ranch. The moon rose late, casting a pale light across the snow, and the wind died down to an occasional gust. It was quiet, the kind of deep silence that only comes in rural Montana, miles from any town or highway. We talked in low voices, going over the evidence, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. Lyle Treadway had disappeared on January 8th. The first tracks had appeared that same night. The rancher had reported seeing tracks 2 days later, and now, almost a week after the initial disappearance, they'd shown up at the ranch again, this time with physical damage and clear signs of aggression. "It's like it's looking for something," Ferris said. "The way the tracks move around, circling buildings, going in and out of structures. It's not random, it's searching." I nodded. "But searching for what? Food, shelter, or something else?" Ferris didn't answer. We sat in silence for a while, watching the barn, and then his radio crackled. It was Mavis, her voice cutting through the static. "All units be advised. We've received a report of a possible sighting on Highway 87, mile marker 158. Motorist called in saying they saw something large crossing the road, northbound. Description is vague, but they said it was moving on all fours and was bigger than a deer." Pritchard's voice came over the channel immediately. "Unit 7 responding. Ferris, Hollister, hold your position at the ranch. I'll check it out and report back." We acknowledged and sat up straighter, the tension ratcheting up a notch. Mile marker 158 was only about 5 miles south of where we were sitting. If something was moving north, it could be heading this way. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cruiser, scanning the perimeter of the ranch. The yard was empty, the barn doors still closed, the cattle quiet in their pen. Ferris joined me, his hand resting on his sidearm. "You think it's coming here?" he asked. I shook my head. "I don't know, but if it does, we'll be ready." 20 minutes later, Pritchard radioed back. "Unit 7 to all units. I'm at mile marker 158. No visual confirmation, but there are tracks crossing the highway. Same pattern, same impressions. They're heading northeast toward the Kemper Ranch." My heart started pounding. "Copy that, Unit 7. We're on alert." Ferris and I moved to the front of the cruiser, positioning ourselves where we had a clear view of the access road and the fields beyond. The moonlight was bright enough now that we could see for maybe 100 yards, and I swept my flashlight back and forth, looking for any movement. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one stretching longer than the last. And then I saw it. Movement at the tree line, maybe 200 yards out. Something large, low to the ground, moving through the snow with a strange, uneven gait. I grabbed my radio. "Unit 12. I've got visual on an unknown subject approaching from the northeast tree line. Large animal, possibly what we've been tracking. Distance approximately 200 yards." Ferris pulled his sidearm, and I did the same. Both of us moving forward slowly, our flashlights trained on the shape. It was hard to see clearly, the moonlight casting shadows that shifted and played tricks on the eyes. But it was definitely there, moving steadily toward the ranch. and as it got closer I could make out more details. It was massive, easily the size of a grizzly bear, but the proportions were wrong. The body was too long, the legs too angular, and the way it moved, it didn't look like any animal I'd ever seen. "Ferris, you seeing this?" I whispered. He nodded, his voice tight. "Yeah, what the hell is that?" We kept moving forward, closing the distance, and the shape stopped. Just stopped, about 50 yards away, and for a moment everything was still. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow, and the wind rustling through the trees. And then it moved again, but this time it didn't come closer. It turned, slowly, deliberately, and I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. Eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight, too high off the ground, too widely spaced. And then it was gone, moving back into the tree line with a speed that didn't seem possible for something that large. I radioed immediately. Unit 12. Subject has retreated into the tree line. No positive identification, but visual confirmation of large animal with reflective eyes. Requesting immediate backup and authorization to pursue. Pritchard's voice came back. "Negative on pursuit, Hollister. Hold your position. I'm en route with additional units, ETA 5 minutes. We stood there, flashlights aimed at the tree line, waiting. The shape didn't reappear. When Pritchard arrived with 3 more patrol cars, we formed a line and moved into the trees, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. We found the tracks immediately, the same segmented impressions, deeper now, pressed hard into the frozen ground. We followed them for maybe a quarter mile, moving carefully, watching for any sign of the creature. And then the tracks stopped, just like they always did, ending abruptly in a small clearing with no continuation. Pritchard called off the search just after midnight. We regrouped at the ranch, cold and exhausted, and he gathered us around his SUV. "We're not equipped to handle this. Whatever this is, it's beyond our scope. I'm going to request assistance from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and possibly the National Guard. We need tracking experts, we need thermal equipment, and we need more manpower. Until then, we maintain patrols, we document everything, and we keep the public informed without causing a panic." He looked at each of us in turn. "And nobody, and I mean nobody, goes into the field alone. We work in pairs, we stay armed, and we stay alert." The next 2 weeks were a blur of patrols, briefings, and dead ends. The tracks appeared sporadically, always at night, always in remote areas. We documented over 30 separate incidents, spread across a 50-mile stretch of northern Montana. The media picked up the story, and suddenly we were dealing with reporters, curiosity seekers, and amateur cryptozoologists who descended on the area looking for proof of whatever they thought was out there. The family of Lyle Treadway held a press conference, pleading for information, and the reward was increased to $25,000. But no new leads emerged. No body was found. No witnesses came forward with anything concrete. I worked every shift I could, driving the same stretches of highway, stopping at the same locations, searching for answers that never came. The tracks kept appearing, kept disappearing, and we were no closer to understanding what we were dealing with than we had been on that first night. Dr. Caldwell's analysis came back inconclusive. The DNA samples from the claw marks were contaminated. The track casts were insufficient for definitive identification, and every expert we consulted had a different theory, none of which could be proven. Some said it was a bear with a deformity. Others suggested a wolf pack moving in coordinated patterns. A few even proposed that it might be something unknown, a species that had somehow gone undetected in the remote wilderness of northern Montana. Pritchard started looking older, the stress of the case taking its toll. We'd sit in his office late at night, going over the files, reviewing the photographs, and he'd shake his head and say, "We're missing something. There's a connection here we're not seeing. But no matter how many times we went through the evidence, the connection remained elusive. And then, 3 weeks after Lyle Treadway's disappearance, the tracks stopped appearing. Just stopped, as suddenly as they'd started. We continued patrols, continued investigations, but the fields remained empty, the snow undisturbed. It was as if whatever had been out there had simply moved on, or gone dormant, or vanished back into whatever wilderness it had come from. The case was never officially closed, but it faded from the headlines, replaced by other stories, other tragedies. Lyle Treadway's file was transferred to the cold case division, and his family eventually stopped calling for updates. Virgil Kemper sold his ranch and moved south, closer to his daughter in Billings, and the property sat empty, the barn doors still hanging open, the scratch marks still visible on the walls. I stayed on with the Montana Highway Patrol, kept working my shifts on Highway 87, kept watching the fields and the tree lines. And sometimes, on clear winter nights when the moon is full and the snow is fresh, I'll pull over at mile marker 151 and walk out into the field where it all started. I'll stand there in the silence, my breath steaming in the cold air, and I'll scan the snow with my flashlight, looking for tracks that I know won't be there. But I keep looking anyway because somewhere out there, in the vast emptiness of northern Montana, something walked beside a man on a frozen night, followed him into the darkness, and took him to a place where we couldn't follow. And whatever it was, I don't think it's gone. I think it's still out there, moving through the snow, leaving marks that disappear before we can understand them, waiting for the next night when the wind is right and the moon is high and someone else drives alone on a lonely stretch of highway. I think about that every time I start my shift, every time I head north on Highway 87, and I wonder if maybe, someday, I'll be the one who disappears. The call came through on a Tuesday afternoon in late February, the kind of day when the sky hangs low and gray over the mountains and the temperature never climbs above 20 degrees. I was halfway through my shift, driving east on Route 200 through the Garnet Range, when dispatch crackled over my radio. Unit 19, this is dispatch. We've got a request from Sheriff Halverson in Granite County. He's asking for highway patrol assistance with a cold case review up at Bearmouth Pass. Says he'd like someone familiar with accident reconstruction to take a look at some old scene photos. I picked up the handset and pressed the button. Copy that, dispatch. What's the nature of the case? The dispatcher, a woman named Mavis Rowe, who'd been working the board for longer than I'd been alive, came back with her usual calm efficiency. Single vehicle fatality from 1987. Driver went off the road during a winter storm. Vehicle rolled down an embankment. Sheriff says there are some inconsistencies in the original report that he wants a fresh set of eyes on. I checked my watch. It was 2:30, and I had another 4 hours left on my shift. Tell Sheriff Halverson I can be there in 45 minutes. What's the location? Mavis gave me the coordinates, a spot about 15 miles west of my current position, high up in the pass where Route 200 cuts through some of the most unforgiving terrain in western Montana. I acknowledged and turned the cruiser around, heading back into the mountains. My name is Calder Rennick, and I've been with the Montana Highway Patrol for 8 years. Before that, I spent 3 years as a deputy sheriff in Missoula County, working everything from drunk drivers to domestic disputes. I grew up in Butte, in a house that sat on the side of a hill overlooking the old mining pit, and I learned early on that Montana could be beautiful and brutal in equal measure. The mountains that tourists came to see in the summer turned into death traps in the winter, and every year we pulled bodies out of wrecked cars at the bottom of ravines, people who'd underestimated the roads or overestimated their skills. I'd worked dozens of accident scenes in my time with the patrol, and I'd gotten good at reading the evidence, at piecing together what happened in those final seconds before a car left the pavement and gravity took over. Route 200 through Bearmouth Pass is one of those roads that demands respect. It climbs steadily through dense pine forest, switchbacks carved into the mountainside with drops that can reach 300 feet in places. The guardrails are old and rusted, installed decades ago and maintained just enough to meet minimum standards. In the winter, the road is a narrow ribbon of black ice and compacted snow, bordered by walls of plowed accumulation that can reach 8 feet high. There are no shoulders, no runoff areas, just pavement and then nothing. I'd worked 3 fatal accidents on this stretch in the last 5 years, and every time I drove it, I felt the weight of the mountain pressing in from both sides, the awareness that one mistake could send you tumbling into the trees below. I reached the coordinates Mavis had given me just after 3:15. There was a sheriff's department SUV parked on the narrow shoulder, and I pulled in behind it, leaving my emergency lights on to warn any traffic coming around the bend. Sheriff Eustace Halverson was standing near the guardrail, a heavy-set man in his late 60s with a salt-and-pepper beard and eyes that had seen too many hard winters. He'd been sheriff of Granite County for as long as anyone could remember, and he had a reputation as a fair man who didn't waste time on politics or bureaucracy. He waved as I stepped out of my cruiser, and I walked over to where he was standing, my breath steaming in the cold air. "Appreciate you coming out, Trooper Rennick," he said, extending a gloved hand. I shook it and nodded. "Happy to help, Sheriff. Dispatch said you wanted someone to look at an old accident scene?" Halverson gestured toward the guardrail, which was bent and twisted in one section. The metal buckled outward as if something heavy had hit it with considerable force. "That's right. Accident happened here in December of 1987. Driver's name was Marcus Keller, 42 years old, worked as a logger down in Drummond. He was heading home after his shift when he went off the road right here. Vehicle rolled down the embankment, came to rest about 200 feet below. He was killed on impact." I walked over to the guardrail and looked down. The slope was steep, covered in snow and dotted with pine trees, and I could see the faint outline of where a vehicle might have tumbled through the underbrush decades ago. "What are the inconsistencies you mentioned?" I asked. Halverson pulled a manila folder from inside his coat and opened it, showing me a set of black and white photographs that had yellowed with age. "These are from the original investigation. State Patrol worked the scene back then, determined it was driver error, probably excessive speed for conditions, but there are a few things that never sat right with me." He pointed to one of the photographs, a close-up of tire marks on the pavement. "See these skid marks? They're straight, no indication of swerving or attempting to correct. It's like he just locked up the brakes and went straight off. And look at this one." He flipped to another photo, showing the damaged guardrail. The impact point is clean, centered. If he'd been driving too fast and lost control, you'd expect to see evidence of fishtailing or sliding sideways. But this looks like he hit it head-on, deliberately. I studied the photos carefully. Halverson was right. The pattern didn't match a typical loss-of-control accident. "What about witness statements? Was anyone else on the road that night?" Halverson shook his head. "No witnesses. The accident wasn't discovered until the next morning when a snowplow driver spotted the broken guardrail. By then, the snow had covered most of the evidence. The investigators did what they could, but the scene was compromised." He closed the folder and looked at me. "The reason I'm bringing this up now is because Marcus Keller's widow, Dinah, she's never believed it was an accident. She's been asking me to reopen the case for years, and I always told her there wasn't enough evidence. But last week she brought me something new." "What did she bring you?" I asked. Halverson reached into his coat again and pulled out a small plastic evidence bag. Inside was a cassette tape, the kind that used to be used in answering machines. This was in Marcus's truck. The investigators cataloged it as personal property and returned it to Dinah after the case was closed. She never listened to it until recently. When she did, she heard something that made her think maybe Marcus didn't go off that road by accident. He handed me the bag. "I'd like you to listen to it, and then I'd like you to come with me to walk the scene, see if maybe we missed something all those years ago." We drove in separate vehicles to the bottom of the embankment, following a Forest Service road that wound through the trees until we reached a point roughly below where the guardrail had been damaged. The snow was deep here, undisturbed except for deer tracks and the occasional fallen branch. Halverson led the way, using a GPS unit to navigate to the approximate location where the vehicle had come to rest. It took us 20 minutes of trudging through the snow before we found it. The trees in this area were older, their trunks marked with scars that could have been from impact, and there were still fragments of rusted metal scattered among the roots, pieces of a Ford pickup that had been torn apart by the fall. I knelt down and examined one of the fragments, a section of the truck's bed that was twisted and corroded. "The vehicle was removed shortly after the accident?" Halverson nodded. "Yeah, a recovery team pulled it out with a helicopter. Took them 2 days to get it done because of the terrain. They hauled what was left to a salvage yard in Missoula, but I doubt there's anything left of it now." I stood up and looked around, trying to visualize the trajectory of the fall. If he went straight off the road like the tire marks suggest, he would have been airborne for the first 50 feet or so, then made contact with the slope somewhere around here. I pointed to a cluster of trees with damaged bark. These impacts would have slowed the vehicle down, but the momentum would have kept it rolling until it came to rest farther down. We walked the scene for another hour, photographing the area, taking measurements, trying to reconstruct what had happened on that winter night 38 years ago. The light was starting to fade by the time we made it back to our vehicles, and Halverson suggested we head to his office in Phillipsburg to listen to the tape. I followed him down the mountain, the road winding through the gathering darkness, and I thought about Marcus Keller and the family he'd left behind. I thought about the inconsistencies in the accident report, the straight skid marks and the centered impact, and I wondered what could make a man drive straight off a mountain road without attempting to save himself. Phillipsburg was a small town tucked into a valley between 2 mountain ranges, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately. The sheriff's office was a single-story brick building on the main street, and Halverson led me inside to a cluttered office that smelled of coffee and old paper. He gestured to a chair and I sat down, watching as he pulled an old cassette player from a drawer and set it on his desk. Dinah said this tape was in the glove box of Marcus's truck. It's from an answering machine they had at home. Marcus used to record over the same tape every few weeks, keep messages from work, that kind of thing. But this is the last recording on it, from the night he died. Halverson pressed play, and the tape began to run. There was static at first, the hiss of magnetic tape that had been sitting in a glove box for nearly 4 decades, and then a voice. Male, tense, speaking quickly. "Dinah, if you're hearing this, something's wrong. I'm on Route 200, about 10 miles west of Bearmouth. There's a car behind me, has been for the last 5 miles. It's not passing, just staying on my bumper, high beams on. I tried slowing down, tried speeding up, nothing works. It's like they want me to know they're there. I don't know who it is, but I got a bad feeling. If something happens, if I don't make it home, tell the kids I love them. And tell Sheriff Halverson that whoever's in that car, they're not just following me. They're hunting me." The tape went silent, just the hiss of static, and then it clicked off. Halverson and I sat there in the quiet office, the weight of those words hanging in the air between us. "You can hear the fear in his voice," Halverson said quietly. He knew something was wrong. He knew he was in danger. I leaned back in my chair, processing what I'd just heard. Did the original investigators know about this tape? Halverson shook his head. No, Dinah never listened to it until last week. She said she couldn't bring herself to go through his things for a long time after he died. When she finally did, she found the tape and decided to play it. That's when she brought it to me. So, we've got a recording of Marcus saying he was being followed, and we've got physical evidence that suggests he went off the road in a way that doesn't match a typical loss of control. What about the car he mentioned? Any reports of another vehicle on the road that night? Halverson pulled out the original case file and flipped through the pages. Nothing. The snowplow driver who found the accident didn't report seeing any other vehicles, and there were no other calls to dispatch about suspicious activity on Route 200 that night. But keep in mind, this was 1987. We didn't have the kind of surveillance or communication systems we have now. If someone wanted to run another driver off the road and disappear, it wouldn't have been that hard. I thought about the tire marks in the photographs, the straight skid pattern that suggested Marcus had locked up his brakes. If another vehicle was forcing him toward the edge, he would have been trying to maintain control while also avoiding being pushed. He might have hit the brakes hard, trying to slow down, and the other vehicle could have clipped his rear bumper or sideswiped him, sending him into the guardrail. Halverson nodded slowly. That's what I've been thinking. And if that's what happened, then this wasn't an accident. It was vehicular homicide. We sat in silence for a moment, both of us staring at the cassette player on the desk. Finally, Halverson spoke. I want to reopen this case, Rennick. I know it's been almost 40 years, but Dinah deserves to know the truth. And if someone ran Marcus off that road, they need to be held accountable, even if it takes decades to find them. I nodded. I'll help however I can. We should start by interviewing Dinah, get a full statement about Marcus's state of mind in the days leading up to the accident. We should also pull records from the local body shops, see if anyone brought in a vehicle with front-end damage around that time. And we need to go back to that scene at first light, do a more thorough search. If there was a second vehicle involved, there might still be trace evidence, paint transfer on the guardrail, something we can analyze. Halverson extended his hand and I shook it. Thank you, Trooper. I know this is outside your usual duties, but it means a lot to Dinah, and it means a lot to me. I stood up and grabbed my coat. I'll meet you back at the scene tomorrow morning, 0700. We'll take another look in the daylight and see what we can find. I left the office and walked out into the cold night, the main street of Phillipsburg empty and quiet. My cruiser was parked at the curb, and I climbed in and started the engine, letting it warm up while I sat there thinking about Marcus Keller and the message he'd left on that tape. He'd known something was wrong. He'd known he was being hunted. And then he'd gone off a mountain road on a winter night, and for 38 years everyone had assumed it was just an accident. I drove back toward Route 200, taking the long way through the valley, and as I climbed back into the mountains, I kept checking my rearview mirror, watching for headlights that might be following too close, for high beams that refused to dim. The road was empty, just me and the darkness and the endless stretch of pavement cutting through the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out here, in these mountains, there was a truth waiting to be uncovered. A truth about what happened to Marcus Keller, and maybe a truth about something else, something that was still out here, still hunting. I reached the spot where the guardrail was damaged and slowed down, looking out at the drop-off and the trees below, and I made a promise to myself that I would find out what really happened that night, no matter how long it took or where the evidence led. I met Sheriff Halverson at the scene just after dawn, the sky brightening to a pale gray that did nothing to warm the frozen landscape. The temperature had dropped overnight to -5, and my breath came out in thick clouds as I stepped out of my cruiser and pulled on my heavy gloves. Halverson was already there, standing by the damaged guardrail with a thermos of coffee and a large evidence kit at his feet. He looked like he hadn't slept much, and when he handed me a cup of coffee, I could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "Appreciate you coming back out," he said. I've been thinking about that tape all night, going over the timeline, trying to figure out who might have had a reason to go after Marcus. I took the coffee gratefully and looked down at the steep embankment where Marcus Keller's truck had rolled decades ago. The morning light made the terrain look even more unforgiving, the trees casting long shadows across the snow. "Did you talk to Dinah last night?" I asked. Halverson nodded. "Called her around 9. She's willing to come in for a formal interview this afternoon." I also went through some old records, pulled the incident reports from the weeks leading up to Marcus's death. Nothing jumped out immediately, but there were a couple of things worth noting. He pulled out a notebook and flipped it open. 2 weeks before the accident, Marcus filed a complaint with our office about someone trespassing on his property. He said he'd found boot prints in the snow near his workshop, and one of his dogs had been acting strange, barking at something in the woods behind his house. We sent a deputy out to take a look, but they didn't find anything suspicious. Could have been a hunter passing through, or maybe just kids looking for a place to party. Marcus didn't push it, and we closed the report as unfounded. I frowned. "And you think that might be connected to what happened on the road?" Halverson shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just coincidence. But the timing bothers me. 2 weeks of someone possibly watching him, and then he ends up dead on a mountain road, saying he was being followed." He closed the notebook and gestured toward the guardrail. "Let's start with the physical evidence. I want to go over every inch of this rail, look for paint transfer, check the angle of impact, anything that might tell us more about what happened." We spent the next hour examining the damaged section of guardrail, photographing it from multiple angles, measuring the height and depth of the impact points. The metal was old and heavily corroded, but in a few places I could still see scoring that looked consistent with vehicle contact. I crouched down and ran my gloved hand along one of the deeper gouges. "This mark here, see how it's angled upward? That suggests the vehicle hit low and then rode up the rail before going over. If Marcus had been driving straight and lost control, the impact would be more level, more distributed across the surface." Halverson knelt beside me, studying the mark. "So you're thinking something hit him from behind, pushed him into the rail?" I nodded slowly. "It's possible. If another vehicle made contact with his rear bumper and forced him toward the edge, he would have tried to correct. But on a road like this in winter conditions, there's not much you can do once you start sliding." We moved along the guardrail, checking each section, and about 15 feet west of the main impact point I found something interesting. A section of the rail had a shallow dent, not enough to buckle the metal, but enough to leave a clear impression. And in that impression, barely visible after decades of weather and rust, was a thin line of dark blue paint. I called Halverson over and pointed it out. "Look at this. Paint transfer. The original investigators might have missed it because it's so faint, but it's definitely there." Halverson pulled out his camera and took several close-up shots, then used a small knife to carefully scrape a sample of the paint onto a piece of evidence paper. "If we can get this analyzed, we might be able to identify the make and model of the vehicle that was following Marcus. Paint formulations from the 80s are pretty distinctive, especially factory colors." I stood up and looked along the road in both directions, trying to visualize the sequence of events. Marcus is driving east, heading home from work. Another vehicle comes up behind him, stays on his bumper for miles. He tries to speed up, slow down, nothing works. Finally, the other driver makes their move, either bumps him from behind or sideswipes him here. I pointed to the paint transfer. Marcus overcorrects or loses traction, slides into the main section of the guardrail, and goes over. Halverson walked to the edge and looked down at the embankment. And the other driver just keeps going, disappears into the night. No witnesses, no evidence left behind except for a paint chip that nobody noticed. He turned back to me. "We need to find out if Marcus had any enemies, anyone who might have wanted him dead. Dinah might know something, or maybe his co-workers at the logging company. Someone out there knows what happened, and after 38 years, maybe they're ready to talk. We packed up the evidence and drove back to Phillipsburg, stopping at a small diner on the main street for breakfast. The place was nearly empty, just a few locals nursing cups of coffee and reading newspapers, and we took a booth in the back where we could talk without being overheard. Halverson ordered eggs and bacon, and I got a stack of pancakes that came with a side of hash browns. While we waited for the food, Halverson pulled out his notebook again and went over what we knew so far. Marcus Keller, 42 years old, married with 2 kids, worked as a logger for Granite Mountain Timber, same company for 15 years. No criminal record, no known debts, no indication of marital problems. By all accounts, he was a solid guy, kept his head down, took care of his family. What about the logging company? I asked. Any disputes with management, conflicts with other workers? Halverson shook his head. Not that I'm aware of. I called the company this morning, talked to the operations manager. He said Marcus was well-liked, reliable, never had any issues. But he also mentioned that the company was going through some financial troubles back in 1987, laying off workers, cutting back on hours. Marcus was one of the senior guys, so he kept his job, but a lot of his coworkers weren't so lucky. I thought about that for a moment. So maybe someone blamed Marcus for their job loss, thought he was getting preferential treatment. Halverson shrugged. It's a theory. We'll need to pull employment records, find out who got laid off around that time, see if any of them had a history of violence or threatening behavior. Our food arrived, and we ate in silence for a few minutes, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I kept thinking about the tape, about the fear in Marcus's voice when he said he was being hunted. That wasn't the word someone used when they were just dealing with an aggressive driver. That was the word someone used when they felt like prey. After breakfast, we headed to the sheriff's office to prepare for the interview with Dinah Keller. Halverson had called ahead and asked her to bring any documents or photographs she had from around the time of Marcus's death. Anything that might help us understand what was happening in his life. She arrived just after noon, a small, weathered woman in her late 60s with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that still carried the weight of loss. Halverson greeted her warmly and led her into the interview room, a small space with a table and 4 chairs and a recording device mounted on the wall. I sat across from Dinah and introduced myself, explaining that I was with the Highway Patrol and had been asked to assist with the investigation. She nodded and folded her hands on the table, her fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you for taking this seriously," she said quietly. "I've been telling people for years that Marcus didn't just drive off that road. He was too careful, too experienced. Something happened that night, something that wasn't his fault." Halverson started the recording and went through the formal preliminaries, stating the date and time and the names of everyone present. Then he leaned forward and spoke gently. "Dinah, I want you to walk us through the days leading up to Marcus's death. Start with the complaint he filed about the trespassing. Tell us everything you remember." Dinah took a deep breath and nodded. It was about 2 weeks before he died. Marcus came home from work one evening and said he'd found boot prints in the snow near his workshop. The prints were fresh, made that day, and they went all around the building, like someone had been looking in the windows. Our dog, a German shepherd named Duke, he'd been acting strange all week, barking at night, growling at shadows. Marcus thought maybe it was hunters using our land without permission, so he called the sheriff's office and filed a report. "Did the deputy find anything when they came out to investigate?" I asked. Dinah shook her head. "No, by the time they got there, more snow had fallen and the prints were covered. The deputy said it was probably nothing, told us to call if we saw anything else." Marcus let it go, but I could tell he was bothered by it. He started locking the workshop door at night, something he'd never done before, and he asked me to keep Duke inside after dark. She paused, her eyes growing distant. Then, about a week before the accident, Marcus came home late one night and told me he thought someone had been following him on his drive back from work. He said there was a car behind him for miles, never passing, just staying on his bumper with the high beams on. Halverson and I, Edot, exchanged a glance. Did he describe the vehicle? Halverson asked. Did he get a license plate or see who was driving? Dinah shook her head again. No, he said it was too dark, and the headlights were too bright. All he could tell was that it was a sedan, dark-colored, maybe blue or black. After a few miles, the car turned off onto a side road and Marcus relaxed. He thought maybe it was just someone in a hurry who didn't want to pass on the mountain roads. But then it happened again 2 nights later, same thing. A car following him, high beams on, refusing to pass. I leaned forward. Did Marcus report these incidents to the sheriff's office? Dinah's voice dropped. No. I asked him to, but he said he didn't want to seem paranoid. He thought maybe he was just being oversensitive because of the trespassing incident. But I could see it was bothering him. He started taking different routes home, leaving work at different times, trying to avoid whoever it was. And then, the night he died, he left me that message on the tape. Her voice broke, and she had to stop for a moment to compose herself. I didn't find the tape until last week. All these years, I didn't know he'd tried to warn me. Halverson reached across the table and gently placed his hand over hers. You couldn't have known, Dinah. And Marcus did everything he could to protect you and the kids. What he recorded on that tape, that's going to help us find out what really happened. We continued the interview for another hour, going over every detail Dinah could remember. She brought out a box of photographs, pictures of Marcus at work, pictures of their family, pictures of the workshop where the boot prints had been found. She also gave us a list of Marcus's co-workers, people who might remember if he'd had any conflicts, or if anyone at the logging company had been acting strangely around that time. When the interview was finished, Halverson walked Dinah out to her car and I stayed behind in the office, going through the photographs and the list of names. One name stood out to me, a man named Torrance Ludlow, who'd been laid off from Granite Mountain Timber just 3 weeks before Marcus's death. According to Dinah's notes, Ludlow had blamed Marcus for the layoff, claiming that Marcus had recommended him for termination. I made a note to follow up on that lead to find out where Ludlow was now and whether he had any history of violence or vehicular crimes. Halverson came back into the office and sat down heavily in his chair. That was hard, he said quietly. Watching her relive all of that. She's carried this for almost 4 decades, and she never stopped believing that Marcus was murdered. I nodded. We've got some good leads now. The paint sample from the guardrail, the name of a potential suspect who had motive and opportunity, and witness testimony that Marcus was being stalked in the days before his death. That's more than the original investigators had to work with. Halverson pulled out his phone and started making calls. First, he contacted the state crime lab in Missoula and arranged for the paint sample to be analyzed and compared against vehicle paint databases from the 1980s. Then he called the Montana Department of Justice and requested a full background check on Torrance Ludlow, including current address, employment history, and any criminal records. While he was on the phone, I went through the old case file again, reading the witness statements and incident reports, looking for anything that might have been overlooked. One detail caught my attention. The snowplow driver who'd discovered the accident, a man named Everett Thorne, had mentioned in his statement that he'd seen tire tracks on the road near the damaged guardrail, tracks that didn't match the pattern of Marcus's truck. The original investigators had dismissed this as irrelevant, assuming the tracks were from another vehicle that had passed through earlier. But now, knowing what we knew about the car that had been following Marcus, those tracks took on new significance. I made a note to track down Everett Thorne and interview him, find out if he remembered any other details from that morning. By mid-afternoon, Halverson had received preliminary information on Torrance Ludlow. He was still alive, living in a small town called Superior, about 60 miles west of Phillipsburg. He'd worked a series of odd jobs over the years, nothing stable, and he had 2 arrests on his record, one for assault in '92 and another for driving under the influence in 2003. Neither charge had resulted in significant jail time, but the pattern suggested a man with a temper and a disregard for the law. Halverson looked at me across the desk. "I think we need to pay Mr. Ludlow a visit. See what he remembers about Marcus Keller and find out what kind of vehicle he was driving in 1987. We left Phillipsburg just after 4 o'clock, taking Route 200 west through the mountains as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. The road was the same one Marcus Keller had driven on his last night, and I found myself watching the rearview mirror more than usual, checking for headlights that might be following too close. The landscape was stark and beautiful, the mountains rising on either side of us, the trees heavy with snow. We passed the spot where Marcus had gone off the road, and I slowed down, looking at the damaged guardrail in the fading light. It looked different now, knowing what we knew, knowing that someone had deliberately forced a man to his death on this stretch of pavement. Superior was a faded logging town, the kind of place that had seen better days and was now just holding on. The main street was lined with closed storefronts and empty buildings, and the few businesses that were still operating looked tired and worn. Halverson had the address for Ludlow's residence, a trailer park on the south end of town, and we pulled in just as the streetlights were starting to flicker on. The park was a collection of aging mobile homes arranged in rough rows, and Ludlow's trailer was at the far end, a rusted single-wide with a sagging awning and a yard full of junk. We parked and approached on foot, both of us keeping our hands near our sidearms out of habit. The trailer's windows were dark, and there was no vehicle in the driveway. Halverson knocked on the door, hard and official, and we waited. No response. He knocked again, louder this time, and called out, "Torrance Ludlow, this is Sheriff Halverson from Granite County. We need to speak with you about an ongoing investigation." Still nothing. I walked around to the side of the trailer and peered through a window, cupping my hands against the glass. The interior was cluttered and dark, but I could make out the shape of furniture and piles of what looked like old newspapers and magazines. Halverson joined me, and we stood there in the growing darkness, both of us feeling the weight of the silence. "Maybe he's not home," I said. Or maybe he saw us coming and decided not to answer. Halverson pulled out his phone and called dispatch, asking them to run a check on Ludlow's vehicle registration. A few minutes later, the information came back. Ludlow owned a 1983 Chevrolet Caprice, dark blue. My chest tightened. "Sheriff, that's a sedan, dark blue, same general description as the vehicle Marcus reported seeing." Halverson's jaw clenched. "We need to find that car. If it still exists, it might have evidence from the accident, paint transfer, damage to the front end. Even after all these years, forensics might be able to link it to the scene." We left a business card wedged in the door of the trailer, with a note asking Ludlow to contact the sheriff's office immediately, and then we drove back toward Phillipsburg. The sun had set completely now, and the mountains were silhouettes against a darkening sky. As we climbed back through Bearmouth Pass, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were getting close to something, that the truth about what happened to Marcus Keller was just within reach. But I also had the feeling that finding that truth was going to lead us somewhere dark, somewhere we might not want to go. The call from the crime lab came through 3 days later, just after I'd finished my morning shift. I was sitting in my cruiser outside a gas station in Drummond, filling out paperwork and drinking bad coffee from a styrofoam cup, when my phone rang. It was a technician named Dr. Vaughn Merrick from the State Forensics Lab in Missoula, and his voice had the careful, measured tone of someone delivering important news. "Trooper Rennick, I've completed the analysis on the paint sample you submitted from the Bearmouth Pass case. I thought you'd want to hear the results as soon as possible." I set down my coffee and pulled out my notebook. "Go ahead, Doctor. What did you find?" There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling. "The paint is consistent with a factory color used by General Motors in their 1982 through 1984 model years, specifically a shade called Nassau Blue. It was a standard color option for several vehicles in their lineup, including the Chevrolet Caprice, the Oldsmobile Cutlass, and the Buick Regal. The chemical composition matches the formula GM was using during that period, and the weathering patterns are consistent with paint that's been exposed to the elements for several decades." I felt my pulse quicken. "So it's definitely from a vehicle manufactured in the early 80s, and it matches the type of car that Torrance Ludlow was registered to in 1987? Dr. Merrick confirmed. "That's correct. Now, I should mention that this paint color was fairly common during that time period. So, the match alone isn't enough to definitively link Ludlow's vehicle to the scene. But, combined with other evidence, witness statements, opportunity, and motive, it could be a strong piece of circumstantial evidence in a prosecution." I thanked him and ended the call, then immediately dialed Sheriff Halverson's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice gruff with exhaustion. "Rennick, tell me you've got good news." I filled him in on the lab results, and I could hear the energy return to his voice. "That's exactly what we needed. I've been trying to track down Ludlow for the last 3 days, but he's not at his trailer, and his neighbors say they haven't seen him in over a week. I've got a bolo out on his vehicle, but nothing's turned up yet. It's like he knew we were coming and went to ground." I thought about that for a moment. He could have seen us at his trailer and decided to disappear. Or maybe he's been planning to run for years, and our visit was just the trigger he needed. Halverson was quiet on the other end of the line. I've been going through old records, trying to find anyone who might know where Ludlow would go if he was trying to hide. I talked to his former employer at a sawmill in Superior, and the guy said Ludlow used to talk about having a cabin up near the Idaho border, someplace his grandfather left him. No address, no legal records of ownership, just something he mentioned in passing. But if he's there, we need to find him before he destroys any evidence. I checked my watch. It was just after 10 in the morning, and I had the rest of the day free. I can head up that way, start asking around. If there's a cabin, someone in the area will know about it. We agreed to meet in Superior in 2 hours, and I spent the drive west going over everything we knew. Torrance Ludlow had been fired from his logging job 3 weeks before Marcus Keller's death. He'd blamed Marcus for the termination, and according to Dinah, he'd made threats about getting even. In the days before the accident, Marcus had reported being followed by a dark blue sedan with high beams on, matching the description of Ludlow's Caprice. And now we had physical evidence. Paint transfer from a vehicle consistent with Ludlow's car, found on the guardrail where Marcus went off the road. It was coming together, the pieces falling into place after nearly 4 decades of silence. I met Halverson at a diner on the main street of Superior, and we spent an hour talking to locals, showing them a photo of Ludlow that we'd pulled from his driver's license records. Most people recognized him, said he'd been a regular at the local bar for years, but nobody knew anything about a cabin. Finally, an older man sitting at the counter overheard our conversation and leaned over. "You talking about Torrance Ludlow? Mean son of a bitch always starting fights when he's had too much to drink?" Halverson nodded. "That's him. You know where he might have gone?" The man scratched his beard and thought for a moment. "I remember him bragging one time about having a place up near Lookout Pass, right on the Montana-Idaho line. Said his grandfather built it back in the 40s, off the grid, no electricity, no running water. He used to go up there when he wanted to get away from people. Can't tell you exactly where it is, but if you head up Forest Service Road 506 toward the pass, you might be able to spot it. Look for an old logging road that branches off to the north, maybe 3 miles in. The cabin's supposed to be back in the trees, not visible from the main road. We thanked the man and left immediately, taking Route 90 west toward the Idaho border. The road climbed steadily through dense forest, the trees pressing in on both sides, and the temperature dropped as we gained elevation. We found Forest Service Road 506 just past the turnoff for Lookout Pass ski area, a narrow gravel track that wound up the mountainside. Halverson's SUV handled the terrain better than my patrol car would have, so I parked at the junction and rode with him, both of us keeping our eyes open for the logging road the man had described. We drove slowly, scanning the tree line, and about 2.5 miles in I spotted it. An overgrown track, barely visible through the undergrowth branching off to the north. Halverson turned onto it, the SUV's tires crunching over fallen branches and frozen mud, and we followed it for maybe a 1/4 mile before the trees opened up into a small clearing. And there, sitting at the far end like something out of a nightmare, was the cabin. It was a rough structure, built from logs that had weathered to gray, with a rusted metal roof and boarded-up windows. And parked in front of it, covered in snow and pine needles, was a dark blue Chevrolet Caprice. Halverson and I exchanged a glance, and without saying a word we both drew our sidearms. We approached the cabin cautiously, moving quietly through the snow, our eyes scanning the windows for any sign of movement. The place looked abandoned, but the tracks in the snow told a different story. Fresh boot prints led from the car to the front door, and smoke was rising from a metal chimney pipe on the roof. Someone was inside. Halverson moved to the left side of the door and I took the right, both of us positioning ourselves out of the line of fire. He knocked hard on the weathered wood. "Torrance Ludlow, this is Sheriff Halverson. We know you're in there. Come out with your hands visible." Silence. The wind rustled through the trees, and somewhere in the distance a bird called out. Halverson knocked again, louder. "Ludlow, we can do this the easy way or the hard way. Your choice." More silence, and then a voice from inside, muffled by the door. "Go away. I got nothing to say to you." Halverson kept his gun trained on the door. "We're not going anywhere. We need to talk to you about Marcus Keller. We know what happened on Bearmouth Pass in 1987, and we've got evidence linking your vehicle to the scene. You need to come out and answer some questions." There was a long pause, and then the sound of movement inside the cabin. The door cracked open, just a few inches, and I could see a figure standing in the shadows. "I didn't do nothing," the voice said, defensive and angry. "Marcus Keller drove off that road because he was a coward. That wasn't my fault." Halverson's voice remained calm. "Then help us understand what happened. Come out and talk to us. If you're innocent, you've got nothing to hide." The door opened wider, and Torrance Ludlow stepped out into the gray light. He was a big man, probably in his late 60s now, with a wild gray beard and eyes that looked haunted and hollow. He wasn't holding a weapon, but his hands were shaking, and I could smell alcohol on him even from 10 feet away. Halverson lowered his gun slightly, but kept it ready. "Put your hands on your head and walk toward me slowly. We're going to have a conversation, and then we'll figure out what happens next." Ludlow hesitated, his eyes darting between us, and for a moment I thought he might bolt back into the cabin, but then his shoulders sagged, and he did as he was told, placing his hands on his head and walking forward. I moved in and cuffed him, checking him for weapons. He had a folding knife in his pocket, but nothing else. Halverson holstered his gun, and pulled out a small recording device. "Torrance Ludlow, you're not under arrest at this time, but I need to advise you of your rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." He went through the full Miranda warning, and Ludlow just stood there, staring at the ground. When Halverson finished, he asked, "Do you understand these rights as I've explained them to you?" Ludlow nodded slowly. "Yeah, I understand." Halverson gestured toward his SUV. "Good. Let's sit down and talk. I want to hear your side of the story." We walked Ludlow to the vehicle and had him sit in the back seat with the door open. Halverson and I stood outside, and I kept my eyes on the cabin and the surrounding woods, watching for any indication that Ludlow wasn't alone. The interview started with basic questions, establishing timeline and whereabouts, and Ludlow answered in short, clipped sentences. "Where were you on the night of December 15th, 1987? Halverson asked. Ludlow shifted uncomfortably. "I don't remember. That was a long time ago." Halverson pulled out a photograph of the damaged guardrail and showed it to him. "This is where Marcus Keller went off the road. We found paint from a vehicle matching your 1983 Caprice on this guardrail. We also have testimony from Marcus's widow that he was being followed by a dark blue sedan in the days before his death. So I'm going to ask you again. Where were you that night?" Ludlow's face darkened, and his hands clenched into fists. He deserved what he got. He took my job, told the bosses I was unreliable, got me fired when I had a family to feed. I lost everything because of him. Halverson leaned in closer. "So you admit you were following him?" Ludlow looked away. I wanted to scare him, wanted him to know what it felt like to be afraid, to not feel safe. I'd follow him sometimes after work just to mess with his head, but I never touched him. I never forced him off that road. I spoke up. "Then how do you explain the paint transfer on the guardrail? How do you explain the fact that Marcus went off the road at the exact spot where we found evidence of your vehicle?" Ludlow's voice rose. "I don't know. Maybe I got too close one night. Maybe I bumped his truck by accident. But I didn't push him off. He panicked, he lost control, and he went over. That was on him, not me." Halverson straightened up and looked at me. "We're going to need to impound that Caprice. If there's any evidence of contact with Marcus's truck, forensics will find it." We walked over to the blue sedan, and I pulled out my flashlight, examining the front end. The vehicle was in rough shape, rust eating through the fenders, the paint faded and chipped. But on the front bumper, just to the left of the license plate, I found what I was looking for. A section of the chrome bumper was dented inward, and along the edge of the dent were faint scratches in the metal. I called Halverson over and pointed it out. "Look at this. Impact damage, consistent with hitting another vehicle. And these scratches, they look like they could match the paint and metal we found on the guardrail." Halverson pulled out his camera and documented the damage from multiple angles. "This is enough for an arrest. Torrance Ludlow, you're being charged with vehicular homicide in the death of Marcus Keller. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right until you have an attorney present." Ludlow's face went pale, and he started shaking his head. No, you don't understand. It wasn't just me. There was something else out there that night, something that made him go off the road." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" Ludlow's voice dropped to a whisper, his eyes wide with something that looked like genuine fear. "I was following him, yeah, I admit that. I was on his bumper, high beams on, just like he said on that tape. But when we got to the pass, something ran across the road in front of his truck. Something big, moving fast. Marcus swerved to avoid it, and that's when he hit the guardrail. I saw the whole thing. I saw him go over, and I should have stopped, should have called for help. But I was scared. I thought if I stopped, they'd blame me for the accident. So I kept driving. Halverson and I looked at each other. "What did you see cross the road?" Halverson asked. Ludlow shook his head. "I don't know. It was dark, and my headlights were on Marcus's truck, not the road ahead. But it was big, bigger than a deer. And the way it moved, it wasn't natural. It was like it knew we were coming, like it was waiting for us." A chill ran down my spine. "You're saying something deliberately ran in front of Marcus's truck to make him crash?" Ludlow nodded frantically. "I know how it sounds. I know you don't believe me. But I've been living with that night for 38 years, and I see it every time I close my eyes. There was something out there. Something that wanted Marcus dead. And I was just stupid enough to be following him when it happened." Halverson closed his notebook and looked at Ludlow with a mixture of skepticism and pity. "We'll sort all this out at the station. Right now, you're under arrest, and you're going to need to come with us." We loaded Ludlow into the back of the SUV, securing him in the rear seat behind a barrier, and I walked back to examine the cabin while Halverson called for a tow truck to impound the Caprice. The interior of the cabin was exactly what I expected. A single room with a wood stove, a cot, and shelves lined with canned food and bottles of whiskey. But on one wall, I found something that made me stop cold. Photographs, dozens of them, tacked to the wood with rusted nails. All of them were of the same location, Bearmouth Pass, the spot where Marcus Keller had gone off the road. The photos were taken at different times of day, different seasons, but always the same angle. Always focused on that section of damaged guardrail. And in some of the more recent photos I could see something else. Dark shapes in the tree line, just at the edge of the frame, blurred and indistinct. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything, documenting the wall of obsession that Ludlow had built. When I came back outside, Halverson was leaning against his SUV, his face drawn and tired. "You find anything?" I showed him the photos on my phone, and his jaw tightened. He's been going back there. For 38 years he's been going back to the place where Marcus died. I nodded, and he's been seeing things. Or he thinks he's been seeing things. Either way, he's been living with this guilt for decades, and it's eaten away at him. Halverson looked back at the cabin. "We'll get a warrant and search this place properly. But right now, we need to get him back to Phillipsburg and start the formal booking process." The drive back down the mountain was tense and quiet. Ludlow sat in the back seat, staring out the window, occasionally muttering to himself. I couldn't make out all of what he was saying, but I caught fragments. "It knew," he whispered at one point. "It was waiting." Halverson and I didn't respond, didn't encourage him. We just drove, watching the road, and I found myself thinking about what Ludlow had said, about something running across the road that night, something that had caused Marcus to swerve and lose control. I thought about the photographs on the cabin wall, the dark shapes in the tree line, and I wondered if maybe Ludlow wasn't as crazy as he seemed. We reached Phillipsburg just after dark, and Halverson took Ludlow into the station to be processed while I drove back to the scene at Bearmouth Pass. I told Halverson I wanted to take another look at the location, see if there was anything we'd missed. The truth was, I couldn't get Ludlow's words out of my head, and I needed to see the place again, needed to understand what had really happened on that winter night so many years ago. I parked on the shoulder near the damaged guardrail and stepped out into the cold. The temperature had dropped below zero, and the wind cut through my coat like a knife. I walked to the edge and looked down at the embankment, shining my flashlight into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the snow and the twisted branches, and for a moment I thought I saw movement. something shifting just beyond the reach of the light. I froze, my hand moving instinctively to my sidearm, and I swept the flashlight back and forth, searching. Nothing. Just trees and snow and the endless silence of the mountains. But the feeling remained, the sense that I was being watched, that something was out there in the darkness, patient and waiting. I stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through my gloves and into my bones, and I thought about Marcus Keller driving this road on his last night, thinking about his family, trying to get home safely. I thought about Torrance Ludlow following behind him, anger and resentment burning in his chest, not knowing that his actions would haunt him for the rest of his life. And I thought about whatever it was that had crossed the road that night, the thing that Ludlow claimed had caused the accident, the thing that might still be out here, moving through the trees, leaving no trace except the memories of those who'd seen it. The arraignment for Torrance Ludlow was set for the following Monday, giving us 5 days to build the case and prepare all the evidence for the prosecutor. I spent most of that time working with Sheriff Halverson, going through every document, every photograph, every piece of physical evidence we'd collected. The paint analysis from Dr. Merrick was solid. The damage to Ludlow's Caprice was consistent with contact against another vehicle, and we had his own recorded admission that he'd been following Marcus Keller on the night of the accident. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Claudia Varnell from the county attorney's office, told us she was confident she could get a conviction on vehicular homicide charges, possibly even second-degree murder if we could prove premeditation. But there was one part of Ludlow's story that kept bothering me, the part about something running across the road in front of Marcus's truck. I'd gone back to Bearmouth Pass 3 more times since Ludlow's arrest, always at different times of day, always looking for some indication of what he might have seen. I'd found nothing. No tracks, no signs of large wildlife in the area, nothing that would explain his claim. But I also couldn't shake the feeling I'd had that first night, standing at the edge of the embankment in the dark, the sense that something was watching me from the trees. I mentioned it to Halverson one afternoon while we were reviewing witness statements in his office, and he looked at me with tired eyes. "You think there's any truth to what Ludlow said?" he asked. I shrugged. "I don't know. The rational part of me says he's just trying to shift blame, create reasonable doubt by introducing some phantom creature into his story. But the part of me that's worked these mountains for 8 years, that's seen things I can't always explain, that part isn't so sure." Halverson leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face. "I've been sheriff in this county for 32 years. I've worked accidents, homicides, disappearances, and every now and then I come across something that doesn't fit the pattern, something that makes me wonder if maybe there's more to these mountains than we understand." He pulled open a drawer in his desk and took out a thick file folder, setting it on the desk between us. "This is a collection of incident reports from the last 4 decades, all of them involving accidents or disappearances on Route 200 between here and the Idaho border. I started keeping track about 20 years ago, after I noticed a pattern. Read through these and tell me what you see." I opened the folder and started going through the reports. There were dozens of them, each one documenting a single vehicle accident, a missing person case, or a fatality on that stretch of mountain highway. The dates ranged from 1971 all the way up to the present, and as I read through the details, a pattern began to emerge. In almost every case, the accidents happened at night. In almost every case, the drivers reported seeing something on the road immediately before losing control. And in almost every case, there were no skid marks, no evidence of evasive action, just vehicles going straight off the pavement as if the drivers had suddenly lost all control. I set the folder down and looked at Halverson. These can't all be related. Some of them are probably drunk drivers. Some are probably just people going too fast for conditions. Halverson nodded. That's what I told myself for years. But look at the locations. Plot them on a map and you'll see they all cluster around a 5-mile stretch of road, right through Bearmouth Pass. The same stretch where Marcus Keller died. I pulled out my phone and opened a mapping application, marking each accident location as I went through the reports. Halverson was right. They formed a cluster, a concentrated zone of tragedy that centered on the exact spot where Marcus had gone off the road. "What do you think it means?" I asked. Halverson stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains that rose in the distance. "I think there's something out there that causes people to crash. I don't know if it's an animal, or a phenomenon we don't understand, or something else entirely. But I think Ludlow saw it that night, and I think whatever it was, it's still there." I thought about the photographs on Ludlow's cabin wall, the dark shapes in the tree line that appeared in the more recent images. If that's true, if there really is something out there, then Ludlow might not be entirely responsible for Marcus's death. He was following him, yes, and he was creating a dangerous situation. But if something else caused Marcus to swerve, then the legal case becomes more complicated. Halverson turned back to face me. "That's why I wanted you to see these reports. Because when we go to trial, Ludlow's defense attorney is going to bring up every one of these accidents, every unexplained incident on that road. And we need to be ready with answers, even if those answers are that we don't know what's happening out there." The weekend came, and I took a personal day to drive up to Bearmouth Pass one more time. I wanted to see the location during daylight, wanted to walk the entire stretch of road and look for anything that might explain the pattern of accidents. I brought my camera, my notebook, and a sense of determination that this time I would find something concrete. The morning was clear and cold, the sky a brilliant blue that made the snow-covered mountains look almost unreal in their beauty. I parked at the damaged guardrail and started walking west, following the center line of the highway, my eyes scanning both sides of the road. For the first mile, I found nothing unusual. The road was well maintained, the guardrails intact, the shoulders clear of debris. But as I approached the highest point of the pass, the terrain changed. The trees pressed in closer, the drop-offs became steeper, and the road itself seemed to narrow, creating a claustrophobic feeling that made my chest tighten. I stopped at a turnout and pulled out my camera, taking photographs of the surrounding area, and that's when I noticed it. On the north side of the road, partially hidden by undergrowth and fallen branches, was what looked like an old trail leading into the forest. I walked over to investigate, pushing aside the low-hanging branches and stepping carefully through the snow. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with years of neglect, but I could still make out the faint impression of where it had been. I followed it for maybe 50 yards, the trees growing denser around me. And then I came to a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a stone cairn, a deliberate stack of rocks that had clearly been placed there by human hands. Around the base of the cairn were objects, offerings of some kind. Coins, pieces of jewelry, photographs, all of them weathered and faded, but still recognizable. I crouched down and examined the items more closely. The photographs were old, some of them dating back decades, and they all showed the same thing. People standing beside vehicles, smiling at the camera, unaware of the tragedy that would soon befall them. I recognized one of the faces from the incident reports I'd read in Halverson's office. A young woman who'd gone off the road in '93. I pulled out my phone and took photographs of everything, documenting the cairn and the offerings, and then I stood up and looked around the clearing. Who had built this? And why? I continued following the trail, which led deeper into the forest, winding between massive pine trees and over fallen logs. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my boots crunching through the snow and the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. After another 100 yards, the trail ended at the base of a rocky outcropping, a natural formation that rose maybe 30 feet above the forest floor, and carved into the rock, worn smooth by time and weather, were symbols. They weren't Native American pictographs, at least not any that I recognized. They were something else, geometric patterns and shapes that seemed to repeat in a deliberate sequence. I spent 20 minutes photographing the symbols, using my flashlight to illuminate the details, and then I climbed up onto the outcropping to get a better view of the surrounding area. From this vantage point, I could see the highway below, the section of road where Marcus Keller and so many others had lost control. I could see the damaged guardrail, now just a small break in the silver line that bordered the pavement. And I could see something else. Movement in the trees on the far side of the road. Something large shifting through the shadows. I froze, my hand moving instinctively to my sidearm, and I watched as the shape moved parallel to the highway, keeping pace with a truck that was climbing up through the pass. The shape was hard to define, partially obscured by the trees and the distance, but it was definitely there. It moved with a fluid, purposeful gait that didn't match any animal I'd ever seen. Too large for a deer, too fast for a bear, too deliberate in its movements to be anything random. I pulled out my camera and zoomed in as far as the lens would allow, trying to capture an image. But by the time I had it focused, the shape had disappeared back into the forest. The truck on the highway continued on, unaware of whatever had been pacing it through the trees. I climbed down from the outcropping and made my way back to the highway, my mind racing. I'd seen something, or at least I thought I had. But what? And more importantly, what was I going to tell Halverson? That I'd found a shrine in the woods, symbols carved into rock, and possibly glimpsed the very thing that Ludlow claimed had caused Marcus Keller's accident. It sounded insane, even to me. I drove back to Phillipsburg in silence, going over everything I'd seen, trying to make sense of it. By the time I reached the sheriff's office, I'd made a decision. I would show Halverson the photographs, tell him what I'd found, and let him decide how to proceed. Halverson was at his desk when I walked in, and I could see the strain of the last 2 weeks etched into his face. He looked up as I entered and gestured to a chair. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Rennick. What did you find?" I pulled out my phone and showed him the photographs of the cairn, the offerings, and the symbols on the rock. He studied each image carefully, his expression growing more troubled with each one. "Where did you find this?" I told him about the trail leading into the forest, about the clearing and the outcropping, about the movement I'd seen in the trees. When I finished, he set the phone down and leaned back in his chair. "I've heard stories about that place," he said quietly. "Old-timers in the county talk about it sometimes, usually after they've had a few drinks. They call it the Hunter's Mark. Say it was put there by trappers in the 1800s, some kind of warning or protection against something in the mountains. Most people think it's just folklore, ghost stories told around campfires. But every now and then, someone claims to have seen it, claims to have left an offering there for protection." He looked at me with serious eyes. "You think what you saw in the trees was real? You think there's actually something out there?" I chose my words carefully. "I think there's enough evidence to suggest that something unusual is happening on that stretch of road. Whether it's an animal we haven't identified or some kind of environmental factor that affects drivers, or something else entirely, I don't know. But I think Ludlow's claim isn't as crazy as it sounds, and I think the jury needs to hear all the evidence before they decide his guilt or innocence." Halverson nodded slowly. "The trial starts in 3 days. I'll talk to Prosecutor Varnell, see if she's willing to introduce the incident reports and your findings as evidence. But I have to warn you, bringing up unexplained phenomena in a murder trial is risky. It could undermine our entire case. The trial began on a cold Wednesday morning in the Granite County Courthouse, a stately brick building that had stood on the main street of Phillipsburg since 1895. I sat in the gallery with other witnesses, watching as the prosecution laid out their case. Prosecutor Varnell was methodical and precise, walking the jury through the evidence step by step. She presented the paint analysis, the damage to Ludlow's vehicle, the testimony from Dinah Keller about Marcus being followed in the days before his death. She played the tape recording of Marcus's last message, and I watched as several jurors wiped tears from their eyes. The case was strong, compelling, and by the end of the second day, I thought we had a conviction locked in. Then, Ludlow's defense attorney, a veteran public defender named Grover Attaway, began his cross-examination. He was an older man, probably in his 70s, with white hair and a gentle manner that belied his skill in the courtroom. He called me to the stand and asked me about my investigation, about the photographs I'd taken at Bearmouth Pass, about the incident reports that Halverson had compiled over the years. And then he asked the question I'd been dreading. Trooper Rennick, in your professional opinion, is it possible that something other than my client's actions caused Marcus Keller to go off that road? I looked at the jury, at Halverson sitting in the front row, at Dinah Keller who had attended every day of the trial, and I told the truth. Based on the evidence I've collected, including witness statements from other accidents on that stretch of road and unexplained phenomena I observed during my investigation, I believe it's possible that an external factor contributed to the accident. However, I also believe that Mr. Ludlow's actions, specifically following Mr. Keller aggressively and creating a dangerous situation, were a significant contributing factor to what happened that night. Attaway pressed me for details, and I described the cairn, the offerings, the symbols on the rock. I described the movement I'd seen in the trees, the shape pacing the truck on the highway. The courtroom went quiet, and I could see the skepticism on some of the jurors' faces, the confusion on others. When I stepped down from the stand, I had no idea if my testimony had helped or hurt the case. The trial continued for another week, with both sides presenting their closing arguments. Prosecutor Varnell emphasized the physical evidence and Ludlow's own admission that he'd been following Marcus. Attaway emphasized the unexplained elements, the pattern of accidents, the possibility that something beyond human control had caused the tragedy. The jury deliberated for 3 days before reaching a verdict. Guilty on the lesser charge of criminally negligent homicide, not guilty on the more serious charge of vehicular homicide. The judge sentenced Ludlow to 6 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. It wasn't the outcome Prosecutor Varnell had wanted, but it was something. Ludlow was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and as he passed by me, he stopped and looked me in the eye. "You saw it, didn't you?" he whispered. "You saw what I saw." I didn't answer, just watched as the bailiffs escorted him away. Outside the courthouse, Dinah Keller approached me. Her face was drawn but relieved, and she took my hand in both of hers. "Thank you, Trooper Rennick. Thank you for not giving up on Marcus." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Halverson came over and put a hand on my shoulder. "You did good work, Rennick. This case would have stayed cold forever if you hadn't been willing to dig into it." We stood there on the courthouse steps, watching as the reporters dispersed and the crowd thinned out, and I thought about everything we'd uncovered. A man's death, finally acknowledged after 38 years of silence. A killer brought to justice, even if the sentence wasn't everything we'd hoped for. And a mystery that remained unsolved, lurking in the mountains, waiting for the next driver who would venture too close. I continued working my regular patrol shifts after the trial, driving the same routes, responding to the same kinds of calls. But I never drove through Bearmouth Pass without thinking about Marcus Keller, about the fear in his voice on that tape recording, about the moment when his truck left the road and tumbled down the embankment. And I never drove through that stretch at night without checking my rearview mirror, watching for headlights that might be following too close, watching for shapes in the trees that moved with purpose and intent. 3 months after the trial, I was driving east through the pass on an evening shift when my radio crackled with a call from dispatch. Unit 19, we've got a report of a single vehicle accident on Route 200, approximately 1 mile west of Bearmouth. Vehicle went through the guardrail and down the embankment. Emergency services are responding. Please proceed to the scene and secure the area. I felt my stomach drop. I acknowledged the call and increased my speed, the cruiser's lights cutting through the gathering darkness. When I reached the location, I saw the broken guardrail, the fresh tire marks on the pavement, the plume of smoke rising from the trees below. It was the exact same spot where Marcus Keller had gone off the road in 1987. I worked the scene with the other first responders, helping to coordinate the rescue efforts, documenting the evidence, interviewing the few witnesses who'd stopped to help. The driver, a middle-aged man from Missoula, had survived with minor injuries. When the paramedics had stabilized him and were loading him into the ambulance, I asked him what had happened. He looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. Something ran across the road. I don't know what it was, but it was big, and it moved fast. I swerved to avoid it and lost control. Did you see it? Did anyone else see it? I told him I hadn't seen anything, that we'd investigate and try to determine what had caused the accident. But as I stood there beside the broken guardrail, looking down at the damaged vehicle being winched back up to the road, I knew the truth. Whatever was out there in those mountains, whatever had caused Marcus Keller to crash all those years ago, it was still active, still hunting. And no amount of investigation, no amount of evidence was going to stop it. The mountains kept their secrets, and some mysteries were never meant to be solved. Over the following months, I started keeping my own file, similar to the one Halverson had shown me. Every accident on that stretch of road, every report of something unusual, every witness statement that mentioned seeing shapes in the trees or hearing sounds that didn't belong. The file grew thicker, and the pattern became clearer. Something was out there, something that followed drivers through the pass, something that waited for the right moment to strike. I showed the file to Halverson one afternoon, and he looked through it with grim recognition. "What do we do about this?" I asked. He closed the file and handed it back to me. "We do what we've always done. We respond to accidents, we investigate, we try to keep people safe. But we also accept that there are things in these mountains that we don't understand, things that have been here longer than we have and will be here long after we're gone. All we can do is bear witness, document what we see, and hope that someday someone will figure out the truth." I took the file and locked it in my desk drawer, and I went back to my patrol duties. But I never forgot what I'd seen, what I'd felt standing in that clearing with the cairn of offerings and the symbols carved into ancient rock. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the highway is empty and the moon is hidden behind clouds, I'll park at the turnout near Bearmouth Pass and walk to the edge of the embankment. I'll stand there in the darkness, listening to the wind move through the trees, and I'll think about all the people who've driven this road and never made it home. I'll think about Marcus Keller and his family, about Torrance Ludlow sitting in a prison cell with his guilt and his memories, about the shape I saw moving through the forest, pacing a truck with deliberate intent. And I'll wonder how many more accidents it will take before someone finally listens, before someone finally takes the mystery seriously and dedicates real resources to solving it. Until that day comes, I'll keep patrolling these mountains, keep responding to accidents, keep documenting the evidence. Because that's what we do. That's what it means to wear the badge and serve these communities, even when the truth is stranger and darker than anyone wants to acknowledge. The mountains are beautiful and unforgiving, and they hold secrets that may never be revealed. But as long as I'm out here, as long as I'm watching, I'll do everything in my power to protect the people who drive these roads, even if it means confronting things that defy explanation and challenge everything I thought I knew about the world. The stretch of Highway 212 between Broadus and the Wyoming border is one of those roads that feels like it goes on forever. A ribbon of asphalt cutting through sage flats and rolling prairie with nothing but fence posts and the occasional windmill to break the monotony. It's the kind of highway where you can drive for 30 miles without seeing another vehicle, where the sky stretches from horizon to horizon and the silence is so complete it feels like pressure against your eardrums. I'd been patrolling this section for 6 years, and I thought I'd seen everything there was to see out here. Cattle crossing the road, pronghorn antelope grazing near the shoulder, the occasional tourist who'd run out of gas and was stranded in the middle of nowhere. But what happened on the night of March 18th changed the way I looked at this job, at this highway, and at the empty spaces between towns where anything could happen, and no one would ever know. My name is Thane Barkley, and I'm a patrol officer with the Montana Highway Patrol, stationed out of the Miles City office, but spending most of my time working the southeastern quadrant of the state. I grew up on a ranch outside Alzada, right on the border with South Dakota and Wyoming, in a part of Montana so remote that our nearest neighbor was 12 miles away. I learned to drive when I was 10, helping my father move cattle and check fences, and by the time I was 16 I could navigate the back roads and 2 tracks in complete darkness without headlights. I joined the patrol when I was 24 because I wanted to help people, wanted to be the one who showed up when someone broke down or got lost or needed assistance. For the most part, the job was exactly what I expected. Long hours of driving, routine traffic stops, the occasional drunk driver or medical emergency. But every now and then, something would happen that reminded me how isolated we really were out here, how far from help, how vulnerable. The call came in just after 9 o'clock on a Thursday night. I was parked at a rest area about 15 miles north of the Wyoming border, finishing up some paperwork and drinking coffee from a thermos my wife had packed that morning. The radio crackled to life, and I heard the voice of our evening dispatcher, a woman named Rita Glenwood, who'd been working the board for as long as I could remember. Unit 23, this is dispatch. We've got a citizen complaint about erratic driving on Highway 212, southbound near mile marker 47. Reporting party says a white sedan, possibly a Nissan, was weaving between lanes and nearly forced them off the road. Can you respond? I picked up the handset and pressed the button. Copy that, dispatch. I'm at mile marker 52 heading south now. Description of the reporting party's vehicle? Rita came back immediately. Black Dodge Ram, Montana plates. Driver's name is Aline Crowder. She pulled over at the Powderville Junction to make the call. She's pretty shaken up, says the sedan came up behind her fast, and then wouldn't pass. Just stayed on her bumper for about 3 miles before cutting around her at the last second. I acknowledged and started the engine, pulling out of the rest area and heading south on Highway 212. The night was clear and cold, the stars bright enough to cast shadows on the pavement, and there was no moon yet, just that vast darkness that settles over the prairie when the sun goes down. I drove slowly, watching for any sign of the white sedan, my spotlight sweeping the shoulders and the ditches on either side of the road. Traffic was almost non-existent at this hour, just the occasional set of headlights heading north, probably ranchers heading home after a long day. At mile marker 47, I spotted something on the side of the road. Taillights, glowing red in the darkness, and the shape of a vehicle pulled onto the narrow shoulder. I slowed down and activated my emergency lights, the red and blue strobes cutting through the night, and pulled up behind it. The vehicle was a white Nissan Altima, mid-2000s model, Montana plates. The engine was running, and I could see someone sitting in the driver's seat, but they weren't moving. I called it in to dispatch. Unit 23, I've got a white sedan matching the description at mile marker 47, southbound shoulder. Running plates now. I punched the plate number into my mobile computer and waited for the results. The information came back clean. The vehicle was registered to a corporation in Billings, listed as a fleet vehicle for a property management company. No warrants, no stolen vehicle reports. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of my cruiser, approaching the sedan from the driver's side, my hand resting lightly on my sidearm out of habit. The driver's window was rolled down, and as I got closer I could see the driver more clearly. Male, probably in his late 30s, wearing a button-down shirt and slacks like he'd just come from an office. His hands were on the steering wheel, and he was staring straight ahead, not looking at me. "Evening, sir," I said, shining my flashlight into the vehicle. "I'm Officer Barclay with the Montana Highway Patrol. I got a report of erratic driving involving a vehicle matching your description. Can I see your license and registration?" The driver didn't respond. He just sat there, hands at 10 and 2, eyes fixed on the road ahead. I could see his chest rising and falling, so I knew he was breathing, but otherwise he was completely still. "Sir, I need you to respond. Are you all right? Do you need medical assistance?" Still nothing. I tapped on the doorframe with my flashlight, trying to get his attention. "Sir, if you don't respond, I'm going to have to assume you're having a medical emergency and call for an ambulance." Finally, the driver turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, and there was something in his expression that I couldn't quite identify. Fear, maybe, or shock. His mouth opened and he started to speak, but his voice was barely above a whisper. "It's following me." I leaned in closer. "What's following you?" He blinked, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. "I don't know. It's been behind me since I left Broadus. Every time I speed up, it speeds up. Every time I slow down, it slows down. I tried to pull over twice, and it pulled over too. Just sitting there watching. I can't see who's driving. The windows are too dark." I straightened up and swept my flashlight down the highway, looking for any other vehicles. The road was empty in both directions, just the glow of my cruiser's lights and the endless stretch of pavement disappearing into the darkness. "Sir, there's no vehicle behind you right now. You're alone on the road except for me." He shook his head violently. No, you don't understand. It was there. It followed me for miles. I called my wife, told her I was being followed, and she told me to call the police. That's when it backed off, disappeared. But it's still out there. I know it is. I pulled out my notebook and started taking down information. "What's your name, sir?" He swallowed hard. Neil Pritchett." I wrote it down. "Okay, Neil, I'm going to need to see your license and registration, and then I want you to tell me exactly what happened from the beginning." He reached into his pocket with trembling hands and pulled out his wallet, extracting his driver's license and handing it to me. Then he leaned over and opened the glove box, pulling out the vehicle registration. I took both documents and walked back to my cruiser, calling in the information to dispatch while keeping an eye on the Nissan. Rita came back with the details. Neil Pritchett, 38 years old, address in Billings, no criminal record, no outstanding warrants. The vehicle registration matched what he'd given me. Everything checked out. I walked back to his car and returned the documents. "Mr. Pritchett, everything looks good here, but I need you to step out of the vehicle so I can make sure you're okay to drive. Have you been drinking tonight? Any drugs or medications?" He shook his head. "No, nothing. I'm just scared. I know how this sounds, but I'm telling you the truth." Something was following me. I had him step out and perform a field sobriety test, just to be thorough. He passed easily, no signs of impairment. His hands were still shaking, and he kept looking over his shoulder, scanning the darkness behind us. "Tell me what happened," I said, pulling out my notebook again. "Start from when you first noticed the vehicle." Neil took a deep breath and tried to steady himself. "I left Broadus around 8:30. I'm a property inspector, was checking on some rental units up there. The drive back to Billings is about 3 hours, and I've done it 100 times. About 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed headlights behind me. They came up fast, and I thought whoever it was would just pass me. But they didn't. They just stayed there, right on my bumper." "How close?" I asked. Neil held his hands about 3 feet apart. "Close enough that I could see the headlights filling my rear-view mirror. I sped up to 75, trying to put some distance between us, but they matched my speed exactly. Then I slowed down to 55, thinking maybe they'd get frustrated and pass. But they slowed down too. It was like they were playing with me, letting me know they could control my speed." He rubbed his face with both hands. "After about 5 miles of this, I started to get really nervous. I tried to get a look at the vehicle, but every time I checked my mirrors, all I could see were those headlights. The windows must have been tinted completely black because I couldn't see anything inside, not even a silhouette." I wrote all of this down, noting the timeline and the details. "Did you try to pull over?" Neil nodded. "Yeah, twice. The first time was near mile marker 55. I slowed down and put my turn signal on, and the vehicle behind me slowed down too. I pulled onto the shoulder and stopped, and they pulled over about 50 feet behind me. Just sat there, engine running, headlights on. I waited for maybe 2 minutes, expecting them to come up to my window or drive around me. But they didn't move. So I pulled back onto the highway, and as soon as I did, they pulled out too and got right back on my bumper." "And the second time you pulled over?" I asked. Neil's voice dropped. "That was worse. I was near mile marker 50, and I was starting to panic. I pulled over again, this time getting completely off the pavement onto the dirt shoulder. The vehicle behind me did the same thing, pulled off and stopped about 50 feet back. I grabbed my phone and called my wife, told her what was happening. She could hear how scared I was, and she told me to call 911. While I was talking to her, I was watching my mirrors, and I saw the door of the other vehicle open." I looked up from my notebook. "You saw someone get out?" Neil shook his head. "No, I saw the door open, but nobody got out. It just stayed open for maybe 10 seconds, and then it closed again. That's when I lost it. I floored the gas and took off, probably hitting 90 trying to get away. And the whole time those headlights were right behind me, matching my speed. Then I called 911, and as soon as I did, the vehicle just disappeared. I checked my mirrors, and it was gone, like it had never been there. I looked down the highway again, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. There was nothing. No sign of any other vehicle. Mr. Pritchett, I'm going to radio ahead to our units in Wyoming and have them keep an eye out for any vehicle matching the description you gave. But I have to be honest with you. Without a plate number or a better description of the vehicle, it's going to be hard to track down. These roads are long and empty, and people disappear into them all the time." Neil grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "You think I'm making this up? You think I'm crazy or paranoid? But I'm telling you, someone was following me and they wanted me to know it. Why else would they match my every move? Why else would they pull over when I pulled over?" I gently removed his hand from my arm. "I believe you saw something that scared you, Mr. Pritchett. And I'm going to do everything I can to find out what it was. But right now, I need you to get back in your vehicle and continue on your way. I'm going to follow you for the next 20 miles, make sure you get safely into Wyoming. And if that vehicle shows up again, I'll be right there." He looked at me with desperate eyes. "You'll stay with me? You won't leave me alone out here?" I nodded. "I'll be right behind you the whole way. Now, get back in your car and let's get moving." Neil climbed back into the Nissan, and I returned to my cruiser, radioing dispatch to let them know the situation. "Unit 23, I'm going to escort the vehicle to the Wyoming border. Driver reports being followed by an unknown vehicle, but unable to provide description beyond headlights and dark windows. No visual confirmation of the subject vehicle. Requesting any units in the area to keep watch for suspicious activity." Rita acknowledged, and I pulled out behind Neil, keeping a safe distance but staying close enough that he could see my lights in his mirror. We drove south through the darkness, the speedometer holding steady at 65, and I kept my eyes moving between the road ahead and my mirrors, watching for any sign of another vehicle. The highway stretched out before us, empty and silent. We passed mile marker 45, then 44, then 43. The landscape was unchanging, just rolling prairie and the occasional cluster of cottonwoods marking a creek bed. My radio was quiet except for the occasional check-in from other units working different parts of the county. Everything seemed normal, routine. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that Neil Pritchett's fear was more than just paranoia or overactive imagination. I'd worked these roads long enough to know that strange things happened out here in the empty places, things that didn't always have easy explanations. At mile marker 40, I saw them. Headlights in my rearview mirror coming up fast from the north. I felt my pulse quicken and I keyed my radio. "Dispatch, Unit 23, I've got a vehicle approaching from behind. High rate of speed. Stand by." The headlights grew closer, and I could see now that it was a sedan, dark-colored, moving at what had to be 80 or 90 miles per hour. I prepared to pull it over, already reaching for my spotlight when the vehicle suddenly slowed. It dropped back to about 100 yards behind me and matched my speed exactly. I couldn't see the driver, couldn't see anything beyond those headlights in my mirror. I radioed Neil. "Mr. Pritchett, is this the vehicle that was following you?" His voice came back over the radio, tight with fear. "Yes, that's it. That's the same pattern, the same way it moves. What do we do?" I kept my voice calm, professional. "Just keep driving. I'm going to drop back and make contact with this vehicle. You continue on at current speed and I'll catch up with you shortly." I slowed down, letting Neil pull ahead, and watched as the dark sedan maintained its distance from him, staying locked on his bumper just like he'd described. When I'd created enough separation, I activated my emergency lights and hit the siren, signaling for the sedan to pull over. The vehicle didn't respond. It just kept driving, maintaining that precise distance from Neil's Nissan. I tried again, this time using the PA system. "Attention driver of the dark sedan, this is the Montana Highway Patrol. Pull over to the shoulder immediately." Nothing. No acknowledgement. No change in speed. The sedan just kept going, following Neil like it was tethered to him by an invisible line. I accelerated, closing the gap, and that's when things got strange. As I got closer to the sedan, maybe 30 yards away, I could see it more clearly in my headlights. Dark blue or black, looked like a late-model Chevrolet, but something about it seemed off. The taillights were dim, barely visible, and the license plate area was too dark to read, even with my high beams on. I got on the radio again. "Dispatch, Unit 23. Subject vehicle is failing to yield. I'm going to attempt a traffic stop. Stand by for backup request." Before Rita could respond, the sedan accelerated hard, closing the distance to Neil's Nissan in seconds. I watched in horror as it got right on his bumper, so close they were nearly touching, and I could see Neil's brake lights flashing as he tried to pull away. I floored my cruiser, the engine roaring as I tried to catch up, and I grabbed the radio. "Subject vehicle is now engaging in aggressive driving, potentially attempting to force the other vehicle off the road. I need backup immediately. All available units respond to Highway 212 southbound, mile marker 38. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the dark sedan was gone. I watched it happen. Arise. Saw it drop back from Neil's bumper and then simply fade into the darkness, like it had driven through a curtain and disappeared. I checked all my mirrors, scanned the sides of the road, but there was nothing. No headlights, no taillights, no vehicle. It was as if it had never existed. I kept driving, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I caught up to Neil at mile marker 36, and he was driving erratically now, weaving slightly, his panic evident even from behind. I radioed him, "Mr. Pritchett, it's gone. The vehicle is gone. I'm right behind you, and there's nothing else on the road." His voice came back broken, gasping. "Did you see it? Did you see what it did? It was going to hit me. It was going to run me off the road." I tried to keep my voice steady. "I saw it, Mr. Pritchett, and I'm going to file a report. But right now, I need you to slow down and calm down. We're only a few miles from the Wyoming border. Once we cross over, I'll have the Wyoming Highway Patrol meet us, and they can escort you the rest of the way home." We drove the remaining miles in tense silence, and when we crossed into Wyoming, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. A Wyoming trooper was waiting at the border, and I briefed him quickly on what had happened before handing off the escort duty. Neil thanked me, his hands still shaking, and then he drove off into the Wyoming night with the trooper following close behind. I stood there at the border, my cruiser idling on the shoulder, and looked back north along Highway 212. The road was empty, dark, and silent. Whatever had been following Neil Pritchett, whatever had matched his every move and then vanished into nothing, it was still out there somewhere. And I had the sinking feeling that this wasn't over, that what I'd witnessed was just the beginning of something I didn't understand and couldn't control. I didn't go home after my shift ended. I drove straight to the Highway Patrol office in Miles City, arriving just after 2 in the morning, and spent the next 3 hours writing the most detailed incident report I'd ever filed. I documented everything, from the initial call about erratic driving to Neil Pritchett's account of being followed, to my own first-hand observation of the dark sedan that had appeared, pursued, and then vanished without explanation. I knew how it would sound to anyone reading it. I knew they'd think I'd made a mistake, that the vehicle had simply taken an exit or turned off onto a side road that I'd missed in the darkness. But I'd driven that stretch of Highway 212 thousands of times, and I knew there were no exits between mile marker 40 and the Wyoming border, no turnoffs except for a few ranch access roads that were gated and locked. When I finished the report, I submitted it to my supervisor, Sergeant Dale Kemper, and then I went home and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those headlights in my mirror, saw the way the dark sedan had moved with that unnatural precision, matching speeds and distances with mechanical accuracy. I finally gave up around noon and drove back to the office, where Kemper was waiting for me in his office with my report spread across his desk. He was a big man in his 50s with graying hair and a face weathered by years of working Montana highways. He looked up as I entered and gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Barkley. We need to talk about this." I sat, my stomach tight with anxiety. Kemper tapped the report with one thick finger. "I've read this 3 times now, and I'm having trouble understanding what you're telling me. You're saying you witnessed a vehicle engaging in aggressive pursuit, you attempted a traffic stop, and then the vehicle disappeared?" I nodded. "That's correct, Sergeant. I know how it sounds, but that's exactly what happened. The sedan was there one moment and then it was gone. No turnoffs, no place it could have hidden. It just vanished." Kemper leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I've known you for 6 years, Barkley. You're one of the most reliable officers I have. You don't exaggerate, you don't panic, and you sure as hell don't file false reports. So I believe you saw something." What I'm trying to figure out is what that something was. He pulled out another folder and opened it. I made some calls this morning, talked to dispatch records going back the last 5 years. You want to know what I found? 17 separate incidents on Highway 212 between Broadus and the Wyoming border, all of them involving drivers reporting being followed by unidentified vehicles. Same pattern every time. Dark sedan, tinted windows, aggressive pursuit, and then disappearance. I felt my chest tighten. 17 incidents? Kemper nodded. Most of them were dismissed as paranoia or road rage situations that resolved themselves. But when you put them all together, when you look at the pattern, it's hard to ignore. Something's been happening on that highway for years, and last night you got a front row seat to it. He closed the folder and looked at me directly. I'm not going to bury your report, and I'm not going to dismiss what you saw, but I need you to understand that this investigation is going to attract attention, and not all of it will be positive. Are you prepared for that? I met his eyes. I'm prepared to do my job, Sergeant. If there's something dangerous happening on that highway, if there's someone out there terrorizing drivers, then we need to find out who they are and stop them. Kemper nodded slowly. All right. I'm going to assign Deputy Orrin McKelvey from Powder River County to work with you on this. He's got experience with unusual cases and he's good at staying under the radar. The two of you are going to set up surveillance on Highway 212. See if you can catch this vehicle in the act. I want cameras, I want documentation, and I want answers. I spent the next 2 days coordinating with Deputy McKelvey, a lean, quiet man in his 40s who'd been working law enforcement in southeastern Montana for over 20 years. We set up a plan to position ourselves at strategic points along the highway during peak travel hours, using unmarked vehicles and dashboard cameras to record any unusual activity. On the third night, we were both in position, me at mile marker 55 and McKelvey at mile marker 40, when the call came through from dispatch. Rita Glenwood's voice was tense. All units on Highway 212, we've got another report of aggressive following. Female driver southbound near mile marker 52 says a dark vehicle has been on her bumper for the last 10 minutes. I was moving before she finished speaking, pulling out of my hidden position on a ranch access road and accelerating onto the highway. Unit 23 responding. I'm 3 miles north of the reporting party's location. McKelvey came on the radio immediately. Unit 47, I'm heading north from mile marker 40. We'll box it in. I pushed the cruiser up to 80, my eyes scanning the road ahead, and within 2 minutes I saw them. 2 sets of taillights, one directly behind the other, moving south at high speed. I activated my emergency lights and closed the distance, and as I got closer I could see it was the same pattern. A sedan, dark-colored, locked onto the bumper of the vehicle ahead with that same mechanical precision. I radioed the lead vehicle. Driver of the vehicle being followed, this is Montana Highway Patrol. I'm the cruiser coming up behind you with emergency lights. Stay calm and maintain your current speed. We're going to handle this. The vehicle ahead flashed its brake lights twice in acknowledgement. I moved up on the dark sedan, close enough now to see details. Black Chevrolet Malibu, newer model. Windows tinted so dark they were nearly opaque. No visible license plate. I hit the siren and the PA system. Driver of the black Chevrolet, pull over immediately. This is your final warning. The sedan didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge my presence. It just kept following the vehicle ahead with that same unsettling precision. I could see McKelvey's headlights approaching from the south now, and I knew we had it trapped. But then the sedan did something I didn't expect. It accelerated hard, closing the gap to the vehicle ahead until it was inches from making contact, and then it swerved into the oncoming lane as if to pass. But it didn't pass. It just drove parallel to the other vehicle for maybe 5 seconds. and I could see the driver of the other car turning to look, their face pale with terror in the glow of my headlights. And then the sedan cut back into the right lane, dropped back to its original position, and before I could process what was happening, it simply wasn't there anymore. I watched it happen in real time. One moment it was directly in front of me, taillights glowing red, and the next moment there was nothing but empty highway. No brake lights, no turn signal, no vehicle, just gone. I slammed on my brakes and brought the cruiser to a stop in the middle of the highway, my hands shaking on the wheel. McKelvey's voice came over the radio, confused and urgent. "Barkley, where'd it go? I lost visual." I keyed the radio, my voice unsteady. "It's gone, McKelvey. It disappeared again, right in front of me." We secured the scene and interviewed the driver who'd been followed, a woman named Justine Holloway, who was driving from Gillette to Miles City for a medical appointment. She was badly shaken but uninjured, and her story matched Neil Pritchett's almost word for word. The dark sedan had appeared behind her without warning, had followed her aggressively for miles, and had refused to pass or back off. When I asked her if she'd seen the vehicle disappear, she shook her head. I was too scared to look in my mirrors. All I knew was that it was there, and then you showed up, and then it wasn't there anymore. McKelvey and I reviewed the dashboard camera footage back at the office, watching the recording frame by frame. The sedan was clearly visible for the entire pursuit, right up until the moment it vanished. We watched that moment over and over, and every time it was the same. The vehicle was there, and then it wasn't. No fade out, no motion blur, just an instantaneous absence. McKelvey sat back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. "I've been doing this job for 23 years, and I've never seen anything like this. It's like it's not even real, like it's some kind of projection or hologram. But it wasn't a hologram. It was real enough to terrify drivers, real enough to show up on camera, real enough to maintain pursuit over miles of highway." Sergeant Kemper escalated the case to the Montana Department of Justice, and within a week we had investigators from Helena going over every inch of Highway 212, checking for evidence of some kind of organized harassment campaign or sophisticated vehicle tracking operation. They found nothing. No tire tracks that didn't match known vehicles, no electronic surveillance equipment, no pattern that suggested human agency. The incidents continued. Over the next month, we documented 12 more cases of drivers being followed by the dark sedan. Always the same stretch of highway, always at night. Always the same pattern of pursuit and disappearance. We tried everything. Roadblocks, aerial surveillance, even bringing in private investigators with thermal imaging equipment. Nothing worked. The sedan appeared when it wanted to, followed whoever it chose, and vanished without leaving any evidence of where it came from or where it went. I started having nightmares. In them, I was driving Highway 212 and the dark sedan was behind me, following with that mechanical precision, and no matter how fast I drove or where I turned, I couldn't escape it. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my wife asking if I was okay, and I'd tell her I was fine, even though I wasn't. The job was getting to me in a way it never had before, eating away at my sense of control and certainty. I'd joined the patrol because I wanted to help people, wanted to make the roads safer. But how could I protect anyone from something I couldn't understand, couldn't catch, couldn't even prove existed beyond witness testimony and camera footage that raised more questions than it answered? 6 weeks after my first encounter with the sedan, Sergeant Kemper called me into his office again. This time his expression was grave. "I'm pulling you off the case, Barkley. You need to take some time, get your head straight. You've been working doubles for a month straight, and I can see it's taking a toll." I started to protest, but he held up a hand. "This isn't a punishment. This is me looking out for one of my best officers. Take 2 weeks, spend time with your family, and when you come back, we'll figure out where to go from here." I took the leave, but I didn't stop thinking about the case. I couldn't. Every time I drove past Highway 212, I'd feel my pulse quicken, my hands tighten on the wheel. And late at night, when I couldn't sleep, I'd pull up the dashboard camera footage on my laptop and watch that moment of disappearance over and over, trying to find some explanation that made sense. I never found one. When I returned to duty, Kemper assigned me to a different patrol area, keeping me away from Highway 212. But I still monitor the incident reports, still track every call that comes in about aggressive following or unidentified vehicles. The dark sedan is still out there. It appears every few weeks, follows someone for miles, and then vanishes back into whatever darkness spawned it. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's one person with access to technology we don't understand, or if it's something else entirely, something that doesn't follow the rules of the world as we know it. All I know is that Highway 212 has become a place where the impossible happens, where the line between the explainable and the unexplainable blurs until you can't tell one from the other. And somewhere out there, on that long stretch of empty highway between Broadus and the Wyoming border, something is hunting. Not for blood, not for money, but for fear. And it's very, very good at its job. I still patrol these roads. I still respond to calls, still help stranded motorists, still do everything I was trained to do, but I'm more careful now, more aware of the spaces between towns where anything can happen. I check my mirrors more often than I used to. I pay attention to the vehicles behind me, watching for patterns that don't make sense. And when I drive past Highway 212, I always whisper a prayer for whoever might be out there tonight, alone on that dark road, with something in their rearview mirror that refuses to let them go.